For as long as Betty Broderick could remember, she had been a mom. Betty was born Elizabeth Ann Bisceglia in 1947 to parents Marita and Frank Bisceglia. And as one of the oldest out of 6 children, she grew up practically raising her siblings. Her mother and father were strict, and told Betty that as a woman, it was her duty to take care of those around her. If someone needed something from her, she was to give it to them without question, and according to her, she always did. Betty spent the majority of her childhood giving to others, even when she had nothing to give. She got her siblings up in the morning, got them ready for school, and helped them with homework, and filled the cups of everyone in her life before she filled up her own. Or at the very least, that is what she told people, as her family was wealthy enough that throughout her childhood, she and her siblings were cared for by multiple maids. Her mother would tell her that her unconventional childhood set her up for success in her life. She had the ultimate hands-on learning experience to be a wife and a mother, which would make her more desirable. She went on to tell her daughter to, quote, go to Catholic schools, and be careful of dating until you find a Catholic man. Support him while he works, be blessed in your later years with beautiful grandchildren. And that became Betty's ultimate life plan. By her own admission, all she wanted was to be a doting housewife and mother to a successful man. She wanted to raise a family the way she had raised nearly everyone in her life, and she wanted to be supported by a man who loved her. And when she met Dan Broderick at Notre Dame University in 1965, she believed that he was the one. She would later tell the Los Angeles Times that when she first saw her future husband, she thought he was a geek and not someone she'd normally go for. I'm real tall and used to go out with athletic guys, she remembers, explaining that at 5'10", Dan was nearly an inch shorter than she was. He had long skinny sideburns, round tortoiseshell glasses. You're talking Geek City. But Daniel Broderick was in school to get his Doctor of Medicine degree, and though he was years away from securing said degree, it came with the promise of a big salary, enough for an entire family. On paper, she felt as if he was a safe and stable choice. However, that choice would lead to Betty spending the rest of her life in prison. Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Today we are going to be covering the case of Betty Broderick and discussing the actions that, to this day, she believes were justified. Reporting on this case is incredibly skewed, partially because multiple Lifetime and made-for-TV movies have been made around this case, and use Betty's narrative for what happened as gospel. When researching this case, my brother and I found that the reporting tends to skew against the victim, despite testimony that was given during the trial by family members and experts. It's incredibly strange to have witnessed, especially since there are a number of people who feel as if Betty's actions were justified. As always, my goal is to provide you with all of the relevant information in this case. That way you can come to your own decision. I will also be leaving links to all of my sources in the description box down below. That way you can fact check it for yourself if you feel so inclined. This case, like the overwhelming majority of the cases I cover, came from a subscriber suggestion, and I couldn't be more grateful. If there's a video or a case you would like to see covered, please let me know by leaving a comment down below or emailing me at dreading.official@gmail.com. I am currently making my way through over 2,000 email recommendations, and though it might take a while, I promise I will get to yours in time. Because this video uses footage from the Oprah Winfrey Show and trial footage that has been copyrighted, it has been copyright claimed by multiple sources, meaning I cannot control the ad placements and I'm not profiting off this video. Any ads that appear will likely be going to Court TV or to the OWN network. As their relationship continued to grow, Dan would tell Betty about all the things they would do together. He wanted to get married, buy a large house, start a family, and take care of them the way he believed men ought to. Early on in his life, he made it a point to list his goals, and Dan was determined to accomplish all of them. He told Betty that he was going to make more money than she had ever dreamed of, and he planned on supporting her the way that she deserved. Betty told Dan while he was in school she had no problem with supporting them, using her newly gotten degree in early childhood education to make ends meet. After a little less than a year of dating, the couple would marry, and Betty would then move in with Dan, which posed a problem, as Dan was still living in his college dorms. The space was small and cramped, especially since Betty had gotten pregnant during their honeymoon, and the living quarters made things tense. Dan's schooling took up the majority of his time, and when he wasn't in class, he was studying. Their finances were strained, as Dan had relied on financial aid and his college loan to pay for his needs, but that wasn't nearly enough to support Betty and their unborn child. With no other options, Betty worked multiple jobs to be able to support the family, and eventually moved them into a new home, nearly 45 minutes away from campus. The stress of the situation led to countless fights, with Betty telling Dan that he wasn't pulling his weight, and Dan telling Betty that she had known that this would be an issue before they were married. He promised that once he was out of school, things would be better. She just had to wait one more year. As her mother told her, it was her duty to support her husband no matter what, especially when it wasn't easy to do so, and she was sure that all of the strife would be worth it once he had gotten his degree. In 1970, Betty would give birth to their first child, a daughter named Kim, and after years, Dan would finally complete school. Betty was elated, as she could finally enter the medical field and begin supporting them. However, Dan announced that he had changed his mind. He just didn't want to be a doctor. He wanted to be a lawyer. Dan told friends and family that in the last months of medical school, he realized that if he combined his medical expertise with a law degree, he would be able to make even more money and tap into an unseen market. He had enrolled in Harvard Law School, meaning that she would continue to have to work as the main provider in the family. According to his own records, he made this decision with Betty. However, she would later claim he came to this decision on his own and sprung it on her at the last minute. This infuriated Betty, who once again had believed that she would be quitting her multiple jobs once Dan was out of school. He had barely graduated and was now telling her he was going back, this time to get a degree in another industry, which she felt was overkill. This led to multiple arguments between Betty and Dan. Betty accused Dan of freeloading and taking advantage of her. She felt as if he was purposely putting off work and that he had sold her on a false promise. This hurt Dan, as he felt as if he was working extremely hard in school to be able to have the money that Betty had stated she wanted. He didn't appreciate being accused of being a freeloader, especially since he had told Betty his financial situation before they got married. Betty would begin to talk about divorce, and how she was tempted to leave Dan to her friends, but she would always talk herself out of it. She felt as if divorce was the coward's way out, and, having been raised Catholic, she felt she would be looked down upon if she chose to leave her husband. Notably though, she also told her friends that when Dan finally did get a job, whether working as a doctor or a lawyer, he owed her that money for all he had put her through. Despite the rising tension and animosity in the marriage, due in part to financial strain, the couple would go on to have 4 more children, another daughter named Lee, 2 sons named Daniel and Rhett, and another unnamed boy, who passed away 4 days after birth. And after getting his law degree in 1969, Dan would move the family to San Diego to become a medical malpractice lawyer. Given both his medical degree and his law degree, he quickly became the #1 lawyer in the area. Within a year of moving, he was earning more than $1 million a year, which, when adjusted for inflation, would be over $8 million in 2022. But even with Dan making good on his promise to his wife, getting them everything from a country club membership, a ski condo, a boat, to a Corvette, the marriage was still dysfunctional. Dan worked long hours and rarely said no to new clients. He was known as being the best in the area, and as such, he was constantly taking on new cases, closing old ones, and, as such, was an incredibly present figure in the family's life. Betty asked Dan to take time off of work, to spend more time at home, and to simply be present with the family more. But Dan would tell Betty that by working these long hours, taking on new cases, and working harder than anyone else at the firm, he was supporting the family the way she had always wanted him to. It seemed that he wanted to make up for her lost time, and over-provide for the family. According to their oldest daughter, Kim, this caused even more friction in the marriage. Dan seemed to be emotionally unavailable, and Betty was fed up. When Dan would come home from work, Betty would scold him in front of the kids. She would loudly complain to anyone who would listen that he didn't care about his family, that he ignored her, and she would demean him publicly, calling him a homophobic slur repeatedly.
And during the marriage, before you separated, you said some ugly things about him in front of other people too. You called him a fag, you called him an asshole, you made derogatory comments about him in front of other people, didn't you?
The Broderick family calls everybody fags all the time.
Mrs. Broderick, did you call him a fag in front of other people at parties and social functions?
Probably, and I probably called him an asshole, sure.
For the way he dressed and carried himself. Their eldest daughter, Kim, claimed Mom would get mad at Dad all the time. Once Mom picked up the stereo and threw it at him, and she locked him out constantly. He'd come home, around to my window, and whisper, "Kim, let me in." On numerous occasions, she would hit Dan, and stated she only did so to provoke a response. However, this only made Dan more emotionally cut off. Dan's brother Larry would later tell the LA Times that his brother didn't pay much attention to her when she got angry and violent. It seemed, in order to protect himself, Dan would detach himself from the situation, and Larry claimed the more it happened, the more he would tune out. And according to the LA Times, that kind of treatment wasn't simply reserved for Dan, as she would regularly do the same to her daughters. Quote, Kim says it was not uncommon for her mother to throw frozen food or to hit Kim and her headstrong sister, Lee. Lee would always say, "Your spankings don't hurt me, you know." She was bratty, Kim recalls. so Mom said, okay, next time you'll be hit with the fly swatter. Lee was out in the yard, and Mom went after her with the swatter, and the little screen came off, so it was just the wire, and she kept hitting her. Lee had big welts all over her legs. During this time, while their kids were still young, the two would go on a couples counseling trip, trying to repair the cracks in their marriage. In journals kept on this trip, Betty would write that all she wanted from her husband was a little bit of effort on his part. She wanted him to care about the family like he cared about work. She wanted to feel as if she was important to him. In response, Dan assured her that she was important, but he wanted to meet his financial goals. Apparently, while Betty had been the sole provider for the family, Dan had taken account of all the things she paid for and everything he had put her through, and he was working as hard as he could to make it up to her. He wanted his wife to feel as if her struggles hadn't been in vain, and once he had properly made up his debt to her, he would take time off. According to Betty, she was more than okay with this, but her daughter said otherwise. Their relationship was still rocky, although no one outside of their close friends seemed to notice. To those who didn't know the Brodericks, they seemed like the perfect family, but to those close to them, they were anything but. In 1983, after over a decade of marriage, Dan would decide to hire a secretarial assistant to help him with his law firm. He didn't make this decision lightly, but Betty encouraged him, telling him repeatedly that he needed to hire someone to help him. That way he could have more time to himself to spend with his family. However, she was greatly displeased by the person he would end up choosing. Dan would go on to hire 21-year-old Linda Kolkina, a woman who had previously worked as a receptionist at his law firm. Linda was a beautiful woman who, like Betty, had been raised to believe that a woman's place was in the home. Her parents told her and her sisters that they should strive to be wives and mothers, and according to her sisters, Linda wanted nothing more than to be a wife and mother. Linda was young, bright, and fun, but also incredibly kind and supportive to those around her. She had an incredible work ethic as well, and when she was offered the role, she was ecstatic. But Betty was anything but. She would later tell Oprah Winfrey that she had always had a bad feeling about the young woman and felt that Linda was a gold digger. She described her as the type of woman who wanted what others had and would do anything to get it. Betty had a strong dislike of Linda prior to her becoming Dan's legal assistant, as she stated that she overheard her husband tell a friend how, quote, beautiful Linda was at a party. This led to a large-scale argument between the couple, with Betty stating that he was only interested in the secretary because she looked like a younger version of herself. In an interview she would give to reporter Amy Wallace in 1990, Betty would state, "That girl had nothing on me. I am prettier, smarter, classier. She is a dumb, uneducated tramp with no background or education or talent." When Linda was hired to work with Dan full-time, Betty was incensed. According to the Broderick children, the relationship between their parents worsened, with Betty going so far as to strike Dan and throw things at him over the slightest provocation.
During this time while you were growing up, before your parents separated, did you ever see your dad beat or hit your mother?
No.
Was there any violence between the two of them?
Well, but at each other?
Yes.
Or-
Did your mother ever do anything violent towards your father?
I never saw her hit him, but she would scratch him and stick her fingernails in his arm. But I didn't see her hit him.
Were there ever any incidents where she threw anything at him?
Yes.
Can you describe?
One
Yeah.
night at dinner, he came in late, and well, I don't know if that was the whole issue, but she threw a ketchup bottle at him across the table. And then one time we went to dinner and we got back and, well, we went out for pizza and we got back and she threw a stereo, and then she threw this thing, this marble thing that has this little, I think you grind something in it or something. She threw that. And that's pretty much all she threw.
While your mom and dad were married, did your mother ever appear to be afraid of your dad?
No.
Did she ever say anything to you about being afraid of him?
No. She's bigger than him. She would laugh about that.
Betty wanted Dan to be incensed and passionate. She wanted him to care the way she did and fight back, and he became even more withdrawn. She believed that Dan had started to have an affair with Linda, and that he was planning on leaving her, and that she was going to be left to take care of the kids by herself. Betty told friends, family, and whoever would listen that despite threatening to divorce Dan for years, it was not an option. She believed that no respectable, well-off man would even consider her romantically at her age, especially when she had 4 kids to take care of. Suddenly, every late night was no longer him being preoccupied at work, as he had been for the last 14 years, but him pursuing a younger woman. The home, which had already been chaotic, was now a battleground. Betty would make repeated threats at her husband and began to disparage Linda constantly, screaming that she was a whore and a slut in front of their children. Dan tried to placate his wife and repeatedly told her that nothing was going on, and her antics had begun to affect his work, as she had directly threatened Linda. On Dan's 39th birthday, Betty paid a surprise visit to his office and found that they were having an office-wide party for her husband, which she had not been invited to. She inquired as to where Dan was, and was told that Dan and Linda had been gone for most of the day following the party, as they had to speak with a client. But Betty couldn't believe that. The idea that she hadn't been invited to the party was bad enough, but him spending the day with his assistant afterwards was too far. She immediately went home, gathered all of his things, and set fire to them in the backyard in front of the children. When the fire eventually went out, she poured black paint on the remnants, making sure that all the items were beyond repair. When Dan eventually did come home that day, thinking he would come home to his family on his birthday, he found that all of his possessions were destroyed. According to Kim, he quietly tried to pick out things that weren't completely ruined and went inside.
Was there a time that you recall when your mother burned your father's clothes?
Yes.
Can you describe how she went about doing that?
The room overlooks the backyard, and she went in and took all the clothes and threw them out the back over the balcony into the grass. And then she dumped the drawers out, and then she went down and put gasoline all over the place and lit it on fire. And then she poured black paint all over the rest of it.
Even according to Betty's estimation, Dan never fought back. Sources for this case vary widely, with many people believing that immediately after being hired, Linda and Dan did start a romantic relationship. This is something that Betty herself has stated repeatedly, as she claimed that Dan spent years lying to her about their relationship. However, she doesn't have direct evidence of this, and given that she will later try to justify driving a car into the family home as being an acceptable response to a court proceeding going in his favor, all of her statements should be taken critically. According to some of Linda's family and friends, this was not the case. It wasn't until much later, after Betty had begun threatening the young assistant, that she began to think of Dan romantically, and they believed that their relationship stemmed out of commiserating over Betty's abuse. Linda, having received threats from her boss's wife, would tell him he deserved better, and allegedly, the relationship sprung from there. In that way, it seemed that Betty had unknowingly brought the two together. Unfortunately, we have no way of knowing when Dan and Linda actually began seeing each other, and what prompted the relationship to start. So take both of these statements critically. Eventually, after a drawn-out argument with Betty, in which she directly told Dan that if he didn't fire Linda, she was going to divorce him, Dan told his wife he was going to leave her. They had moved out of the family home, due in part to renovations being made on the house, and he paid for Betty to stay in a home with the children. He then went back to the home despite the construction and began to plan their divorce. However, Betty wasn't going to let Dan leave without a fight. From the very start of the couple's divorce, things were messy. Despite her negative feelings for her ex-husband and her assertion that she wouldn't get back together with him even if he begged her to, she decided that she would never change her name. According to those around her, she wanted to make it clear she was the original Mrs. Broderick, and in her mind, the only one. Betty had already been calling Dan a piece of shit and a scumbag in front of the children, and she made no qualms about discussing their private life with them. Betty seemed to have no want to keep things amicable, or to parent in unison with her former husband, but instead wanted the kids to take sides. More specifically, her side. Betty would constantly talk negatively about her husband, telling anyone who would listen about how she hated him and wanted him dead. When her eldest son asked her mother what their last name Broderick meant for a school report, Betty said that it meant a piece of shit, and when he asked her to be serious, as it was for school, she continued on ripping her ex apart. Reportedly, this interaction left her son in tears, as he was a Broderick, and felt as if she was claiming that he was all of those things that she was listing. Originally, Betty was given custody of the kids. Dan stated that despite his wife's anger towards him, he wanted to try and go without disrupting the lives of their kids as much as he could. But Betty had other ideas. Over the span of a month, Betty gave up custody of all 4 children by dumping them on Dan's doorstep. It was on Easter, Kim recalls. I asked her to drive my friends home, and she lost it. She said, "Pack your bags." When Kim arrived at her father's, no one was home, and she waited hours on the doorstep for Dan to return. In a few days, Danny arrived the same way, followed by Rhett and Lee a month later. They were hysterical, holding on to her, crying and screaming, crying hard, "Don't leave us here, it was awful," Kim says. She said, "I'm leaving. Your dad's not going to get away with this." This was despite the fact that Dan hadn't done anything, and she was willingly parting with the children. Betty claimed later on she did this in order to show Dan how hard parenting was, because he had spent the majority of their lives at work. Betty felt that he would be ill-equipped to be a parent, and would realize how much he needed her. Despite saying that she wanted to leave for years, she also held out some hope that by reuniting Dan with his children, the family might stay intact, if only out of convenience. In divorce court, Betty would state that Dan had stolen custody from her, and was maliciously keeping the children out of spite. She also claimed that Dan had, quote, used his legal influence to win sole custody over the children, unquote, despite the fact that by her own admission, she gave them up.
Under gentle, direct examination, Kim Broderick tells of how she and her siblings were victims of a messy divorce. She says her mother left the kids at Dan's doorstep, one at a time.
Can you describe how it was that you ended up over there?
Well, it was on Easter, it was the night before Easter, and Mom and I got in an argument because I had this friend over that I wanted her to take home. And we had just been at Warden Springs, and she didn't want to take her home. She was tired, so she said no. And then we got in an argument, so I went back into my room, and then Mom came in and said that pack up and leave, that she didn't want me there anymore. I can go live with Dad, so then I packed up and left.
So you packed up your clothes, and did she take you over to your dad's house?
Yes.
At some later point, did either of your brothers or sister come over to Coral Reef?
My brother Danny came over the next day on Easter, and then my sister Lee and Rhett came over a month or two later.
How was it that Danny was brought over?
He was fighting with Rhett, and Mom had enough of it, so she told him to pack up and move with me.
Did she actually bring him over?
Yes.
What was his emotional state when he was brought over?
He was really upset. He didn't want to come over there.
Was he crying?
Yes.
Dr. Ruth Roth worked on behalf of the children during the Broderick divorce. While trying to resolve the couple's custody battle, she had some surprising sessions with Betty Broderick.
She was just very angry, and at that point, I let her run with it. I thought that if she got to say all the things that she wanted to say that I thought were pent up inside, then I could get to the agenda that I needed to deal with.
Okay.
And so I let her go.
Okay. And then what happened?
Toward the end, I told her that it seemed to me, more in an attempt to mollify her, that she had been the primary parent, that she had been what I call a stay-home mommy. And that it seemed to me that regardless of what happened, probably by the end of this mediation, she could get the kids back.
And what was her response to that?
She got even angrier.
Okay. What did she say?
She said, quote, "I'm not going to be a single parent of 4 kids. He'll die first."
What do you recall how you responded to that?
Probably said, "What?" And she went on.
What did she say?
She said, "The less I see them or hear from them, the better. No bother, no kids." End quote.
In comparison to all of the people that you've dealt with mediating child custody disputes, and obviously seeing different variations of anger, where would you put Elizabeth Broderick?
She may be the angriest person I ever saw. She's one of the top 2 anyway.
In an effort to give them a chance to start over, Dan sold the family's old home, a move that Betty believed was meant to spite her. She claimed he hadn't conferred with her about the sale, and felt as if he was purposely uprooting her life in order to make her suffer. She would directly accuse Dan of attempting to make her homeless and ruin the lives of her and the kids. This was in spite of the fact, according to the court record, they had agreed to sell the home together, and she earned a steep payout from the sale. The following is from the article Broderick versus Broderick, which goes over the divorce proceedings in detail. After the Brodericks had agreed to sell their La Jolla home in early 1986, Betty balked at the last minute, forcing Dan's lawyer to obtain an emergency court order to sell the house. And although Mrs. Broderick holds out that incident as evidence of Broderick's masterful ability to manipulate the court system, her lawyer at the time says he was disgusted with Betty's actions. I got her far more money for the house than she was entitled to get, but she wouldn't follow my advice, her former attorney recalled. She later stymied an agreement to have the divorce mediated by purposely misspelling her name on a mediation contract. Every day, she left derogatory voicemails for Dan, Linda, and the kids at their home and work, repeatedly telling them that she was going to kill them, and going into sexually explicit detail about what she wanted to do to them. Whenever she spoke to the kids, she would tell them what a horrendous person their father was, despite them begging her not to.
This is a message to and the... You have one hell of a nerve dumping the kids here on the sidewalk and zooming away without making any attempt to communicate with me about my plans for the weekend. Make me sick, the both of you. Return my call right away, thank you. Stop going long enough to return my call. Left messages on the machine, with the maid, with the secretary, etc., etc. I have very important things to ask you. You're making me mad. I'll kill you.
A conversation between Broderick and her then 11-year-old son, Danny.
Just to get his money.
Yeah, that's right.
Then if he knows that, then how come he doesn't stop?
Because he's so stupid. He doesn't care because he knows the money. But that money is mine. I earned it. I earned it for 20 years of hard work and total shit. For that.
Yeah, but you're never going to see us again. Don't you care about your family besides the stupid money?
I care perfectly about my family.
Then how come you won't just shut your mouth so we can come over there?
Somebody else is on the phone.
And I don't care.
No, I don't care either. I took absolute perfect care of my family. I was the best mommy in the whole world and the best wife in the whole world. It's not my fault your father's such a... I care plenty about my family. I only work 24 hours a day for 17 years.
So then fine. If it isn't your fault, then why don't you just mind your own business and not care if...
I don't mind my own business.
And don't care who he's seeing. He could be seeing a totally different girl. It wouldn't make a difference.
Well, I guess you're a real California kid. Congratulations. You're bringing scrambled eggs. You've been living with him too long. You don't have any sense of value, right and wrong, up and down, in and out, black and white, truth or lie. Stay living with him, your whole head will go spin.
No, all you care about is the money.
That's what he tells you, right?
No. But that's all. No, that's what you tell me. Okay, what else do you care about besides your money and your share of things to own?
What do you think else do I care about? I cared about my family bad enough to put up with him, Linda, for 2
Yeah, well, if you care about your family, if you stop saying bad words, Mom.
I repeat again, I'd rather be a lady and a wonderful person and call.
Well, you're not going to be a wonderful person to very many people if you don't stop saying those bad words.
And you are my 4 kids that he took away from me for Christmas and put you in an ugly apartment where I could...
No, but he did take us away. You gave us to him.
On Christmas?
No, on Easter. You sent me over there on Easter, and in a couple hours more, they were over here.
Mm-hmm. And you've just been having a good time ever since, haven't you?
No, we haven't. We're having a horrible time. You keep on saying the bad words, and we're never going to be able to come over there if you don't stop. And if you don't stop, it just shows me that all you care about is your money.
Betty broke into Dan's new home and spray painted obscene messages in their bathroom. She vandalized the home, destroying pictures and valuable items, and leaving evidence to show that she was the one who had done so. However, when it was later brought up to her, she claimed that she had no part in it. Instead, she claimed it was an elaborate ruse being done by the couple to make her look bad. It wouldn't be until a witness came forward, placing her at the scene, and proof showing she had purchased the spray paint can, came out that she admitted it had been her, but she stated that the two deserved it for all they had put her through. This spurred the couple into buying a security system for the home. That way, should anything occur, they would have tangible proof Betty was behind it. This would happen often. Betty would break the law and threaten to kill Dan and Linda. Then when confronted about it, she would say she didn't do anything. Then when it would be proven that she had broken the law, she would admit that she had done it, but then claim that the couple forced her to do it because they had ruined her life. Dan eventually filed a restraining order against Betty, something that his brother Larry had suggested that he didn't want to do. According to friends of Dan didn't know how to properly respond to Betty's actions. When he tried to confer with her about the living arrangement and alimony, she would claim he was lowballing her by only giving her $20,000 a month, and that he was trying to put her in abject poverty. When he offered to give her any of the furniture she wanted from their former home, have it shipped and installed for her, she claimed he was trying to threaten and control her. But when she went too far and threatened his life, and he got police involved, she would claim he was using law enforcement as a weapon and abusing her. It seemed that no matter what he did, he was in the wrong in Betty's eyes. Betty would return to his home 2 more times, despite the restraining order. The first time, he said, she took a cream pie from the kitchen and smeared it all over the master bedroom. 4 days later, he said, she threw bottles of wine through 2 windows and smashed a sliding glass door. Following another restraining order being filed, Betty would use an umbrella to bash a large picture window and smash a toaster in the home. Betty felt as if she was no longer welcome at country clubs, ski resorts, and high-class parties she had gone to with Dan, as he was tarnishing her name. But multiple former friends of hers would state in court that Dan hadn't said anything negative about his ex-wife, but that after the divorce, her tangible anger made them scared of her. She seemed unable to focus on anything outside of her rage towards them. A former friend was quoted as saying, "We could be talking about something and she would find a way to bring it back to how much she hated them and wanted them dead. It just became uncomfortable."
Linda David was a housekeeper for Dan Broderick after the divorce.
When you would have conversations with Mrs. Broderick, did she ever talk to you about her feelings about Dan and Linda?
Yes.
Can you describe, would that be occasionally, often, all the time?
Most of the time. She had a lot of hate for her former husband, and mostly that's what she would talk about. How much she hated him, things that had gone on between them in the past, things that were going on between them in the present, that type of thing.
When you indicate that she had a lot of hate for Mr. Broderick, how did you know that? What would she say?
That's what she said. A lot of hatred for him, a lot of name-calling, a lot of threats. Fairly aggressive or violent language.
Did she say anything about Dan and Linda or what she wanted to do as far as Dan and Linda were concerned in that conversation?
Well, when I said I thought that the court situation was all settled and behind them, she said that she was sure that Dan and Linda would like her to just go away and leave them alone and let them live in peace. But that wasn't going to happen. And she said that she was going to continue to make Dan miserable and make his life a living hell or kill him.
The state calls another housekeeper, Robin Tuwa, to testify about Betty Broderick's effect on her children.
Did you ever specifically overhear a conversation that she had with her son, Rhett, that was very upsetting to Rhett?
Yes, I did. She told Rhett she wouldn't see Rhett if she didn't get the out of the house, referring to Linda.
Okay, if who wouldn't get Linda out of the house?
If Rhett wouldn't get, I don't want to use that word again.
That's fine.
All right, she would, the stipulation is she wouldn't see Rhett unless Rhett would get Linda out of the house. He was completely distraught over that. He was very upset.
Was there something that he did after that particular conversation?
Yes, he did. He was so upset. He went upstairs and he locked himself in the bathroom. I thought he was using the restroom. He was too quiet for a while. And I knocked on the door and asked him if he'd come out. And when he came out, he had scissors in his hand, and he had taken chopped clumps of hair out of his head and saying he wanted to get the pain out of his head his mom put in his head.
But the abuse and anger she felt wasn't just directed at Dan and Linda. Whenever her children told her they didn't agree with how she was treating their father, Betty would lash out at them. Kim would recall later her mother calling her out of the blue to say, quote, "I was driving down the street right by SeaWorld, and all of a sudden I just remembered that I hate your guts. You just make me sick. You're a traitor. You make me sick. You make me want to throw up. I wish you were never born." She was similarly vitriolic towards her other kids, telling them that they didn't support her and were being brainwashed. But these were just the first things in a long list of claims made by Betty. She also believed that Dan, being a prominent medical malpractice lawyer, had used his sway in the community to make it hard for her to find a lawyer to represent her in court. But how true this statement is remains to be seen, as Betty made herself incredibly difficult to represent. In any legal document where Dan's name was mentioned, Betty defaced it, writing God over his name, and writing snarky remarks about Linda, claiming she was unseemly and disgusting. At multiple intervals, she was found in contempt of court, as she often would speak over the judge and lawyers, claiming that they were all working with her ex, and she was being ignored. She would be represented by multiple different lawyers at different intervals, but would refuse to pay them, instead giving them expensive jewelry, which she claimed was the same thing. She then claimed Dan was the one who was responsible for paying her legal fees, and that he had purposely missed payments to keep her from getting counsel. Her former lawyer spoke out against this themselves, and stated outright that her antics caused them to drop her, as she would refuse to stop harassing Dan. Betty would go to multiple charities and foundations that were established to help abuse victims seek justice. She approached these nonprofits and explained to them how she had been psychologically abused for years by Dan, how he had cheated on her and was putting her through hell. In multiple instances, these charities would take her case, but upon working with her, they would become aware of her actions. The years of voicemails, the abusive language used in front of the children, breaking into the home, and more showed how she turned into the aggressor, and representing her wouldn't align with their values. In response, Betty claimed that Dan had gotten to these charities just to spite her, but there are no records showing that. She ultimately represented herself, and purposely held up proceedings with nonsense. She would misspell her name intentionally on legal documents, then claim it wasn't her signature. She stated that she was being purposely silenced, and she accused her husband and his new girlfriend of vile actions while in court. After one stressful day, Betty would ram her car through the front door of her former husband's Hillcrest home with the knowledge that her children were inside. In court documents, Dan declared that when he opened the door to pull Betty out of the wreckage, she reached for a large butcher knife under the seat and attempted to use it on him. It was clear that she attempted to take not only his life, but the lives of the children. She would later claim that she had to do this, as Dan had just used his influence to beat her in court, and she was frustrated. Dan's friends and family would state that he was scared of his ex-wife and believed she wanted him dead, but he was more fearful of taking action against her. He would file contempt charges against her in court and put restraining orders out against her, but would refuse to call the police when she broke them and put his life in danger, as he felt that doing so wouldn't help. She was the mother of his children, and he really didn't take the strong measures he should have taken, says Ned Huntington, a friend of Dan's who often advised him to take stronger action against Betty. He didn't want the guilt of being punitive towards her, so he let her get away with a lot of atrocious acts. He just wouldn't punish her. Following her driving the car into his home, Betty was forcefully committed to a mental health facility. This too would be spun as being done maliciously, to hurt her more than help her. But again, she had driven a car into his home with their children in it, which is attempted murder. She refused to cooperate with treatment, thinking that she had been sent there under false pretenses, and when she left, she was angrier than ever. The divorce played out over the course of 4 years, with Betty stalling the proceedings multiple times outright. Dan attempted to get his ex-wife to stop acting out, docking her support payments when she left abusive voicemails for their children and threatened to attack Linda and him, and he began sending her letters in curt legalese. Dan began to withhold $100 for every obscene word she used, $250 for each time she set foot on his property, $500 for every entry into his house, and $1,000 for every time she took one of the children without his permission. He felt if he detached emotion from any of his responses and simply penalized bad behavior, Betty would understand that he was trying to maintain some semblance of order, but it only made her angrier. Betty would also allege that she had received abusive letters in the mail that she believed were sent by the couple. It started with a picture of the couple kissing, with a post-it note inside that simply read, "Eat your heart out." Then she began to receive what she called abusive ads for weight loss centers, diet pills, and plastic surgery. She believed that Linda was the only person who could be behind this, although, it should be mentioned, none of these letters or ads were ever seen by others, and at the time, med spas were known to send out letters like this to everyone in the area. Friends of the couple would also claim that they wouldn't have sent letters taunting Betty in this way, as they were genuinely fearful of what she would do to them. Betty would claim that this was completely unjustifiable, abusive, and like, quote, putting a housewife in the ring with Muhammad Ali, unquote. But after 4 years, the divorce was finally finalized. Betty would characterize this divorce as taking everything from her. She claimed that Dan had sold the house out from under her, which was untrue, that he left her with nothing, which was also untrue, and that, most importantly, he had taken the kids, which again was not the case. To hear her describe it, she had nothing to her name, except for the house he had given her, and, according to the LA Times, a car, a closet full of $8,000 ball gowns and $2,000 outfits, $9,036 a month, which was tax-free, a teaching credential, a real estate license, a doting boyfriend of multiple years, and plenty of friends. But to Betty, that was nothing. Even her boyfriend, Bradley Wright, who was incredibly devoted to her, wasn't someone she would admit to caring about. Despite going on romantic getaways and living together, Betty would state that having him around was, quote, like having a dog, but he was house-trained. According to Betty's children, the relationship between the pair was great. They got along well, and Betty felt comfortable enough to bring him around the children, with Lee walking in on the couple in the shower together. Despite this, Betty would claim that her relationship with Brad wasn't romantic, and was a step down from the one she had with Dan. As Brad didn't have the money, her first husband did. Kim would go on to say, Mom could never admit that she'd never have a happy life. That would be admitting that she could get on with herself, and that Dad didn't ruin her life. During the divorce proceedings, Dan had proposed to Linda, and they had been waiting to get married, but both Linda and Dan were nervous. They had thought the divorce, being finalized, would have led to a ceasefire from Betty, but she'd only grown angrier with time. Dan and Linda knew that getting married was a risk, and that if Betty knew where they were holding the wedding and the reception, she would likely show up and attack them. With that in mind, Dan wore a bulletproof vest under his suit, and they hired multiple security personnel to protect them during their wedding and the reception. Surprisingly, though, Betty never made an appearance, though it seemed that she had planned to, buying a Smith & Wesson revolver the month prior, and spending a significant time at the shooting range. However, that would not be the end of the back and forth, as a little over 7 months later, Betty would finally snap. On November 3rd, 1989, 4 days before Betty's 42nd birthday, yet another round of legal papers arrived at the door. Dan was threatening to file criminal contempt charges unless she stopped leaving lewd messages on the answering machine. Despite him asking for her to simply stop harassing him, Betty felt as if he was asking too much. He was trying to silence her and take away her freedom of speech, and she wasn't going to allow that. According to her, the threats pounded in her head all day, as he had finally gone too far, asking for her to stop calling him, telling him that she was going to murder him, and leaving messages for her kids to hear was a bridge too far, and she wasn't going to stand for it anymore. Just before dawn on Sunday, November 5th, she left the bed she shared with Bradley. She dressed, grabbed her gun, and got into her car to drive to her ex-husband's home. She used her older daughter's key that she had stolen without Kim's knowledge to let herself in. She quickly ascended the staircase and opened the door to the couple's bedroom, finding them peacefully sleeping. She pointed the gun at the bed and shot 5 times. 1 bullet hit a bedside table, another pounded into the wall, but 3 bullets struck the sleeping couple. 1 pierced Linda's neck and lodged into her brain, and another hit her in the chest. A 3rd perforated Dan's back, fracturing a rib and tearing through his right lung. She wasn't sure that she had just killed the couple, but she wanted to be sure that they wouldn't be able to get any help. She then entered the room, yanked the phone that had been placed on the bedside table out of the wall, and fled. Afterwards, she called her daughter.
Prosecutor Paul Burkhoff questions Lee about Betty Broderick's call to Lee the morning of the incident.
What time was it approximately?
Approximately around 7 a.m.
Did you answer that phone call?
Yes, I did.
Who was in the line?
It was my mom.
What did she tell you?
She said she was in trouble and she needed my help.
What else did she say?
She told me that she shot my dad. She shot the son of a bitch. She wanted to come to my house. And I told her to come.
Once she got there, did your mother tell you more about what went on?
Yes.
What did she tell you?
She told me that she thought she had shot my dad, but she didn't know because it was dark and drapes were drawn. She wasn't sure. She said she shot the gun 1 time, but it fired 5 or 6 times. She
told me that she didn't know what had happened because the drapes were drawn and it was completely dark. I was asking her if she had hurt anyone, if there was any screams or blood or anything like that. And she told me that she didn't think that she had hurt my dad because he had sat up and said, all right, you shot me, I'm dead.
Following the murder, the press became fascinated with the case, as Betty was the only person left alive to talk about what had happened. She made no qualms about putting the blame for the murders directly on the victims, Dan and Linda Broderick. Her lawyers claimed that she was a psychologically battered woman who had been driven over the edge by her sociopathic lawyer ex-husband. She characterized Linda as an uneducated blonde bimbo with, in her own words, a loose vagina, who wanted nothing more than to take what wasn't hers, and certain media outlets took her narrative and ran with it. Multiple made-for-TV movies came out, characterizing the restraining orders against Betty as being uncalled for, Dan as being outright abusive and evil, and the kids being forced to live with their father against their will. However, as court records and evidence would prove, that was far from the case. Once more, Betty was made to undergo a psychiatric evaluation and was found to have histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders. Psychologists stated that due to Betty's narcissistic personality disorder, she had an extreme need to control things, and she had focused her entire life on being a mother. With the loss of control, Betty felt she needed to go to extreme measures to regain it, and felt justified murdering Dan because of it. Betty claimed that the night she had gone to the couple's home, she hadn't intended on killing them, despite the voicemails she left over the span of 5 years threatening to do so. No, instead, she said, she went to the home with the intention to kill herself in front of the couple. She stated she wanted them to see what they had done to her, how they had destroyed her, and that, by killing herself in front of them, they would finally be forced to listen to her. However, when she went into the home, she claimed that the couple, who were asleep in bed, scared her, and she shot them 5 times, out of self-defense. And seemingly, this defense would work. Broderick's first trial ended with a hung jury when 2 of the jurors held out for manslaughter, citing lack of intent. They believed that Betty hadn't planned to kill the couple, and therefore couldn't be charged with first-degree murder. Like before, Betty would go through multiple lawyers before finding one that she would finally take to trial. Betty, again, would claim that her previous lawyers had been out to get her, to make her look insane, and were friends of Dan. But as before, her lawyers would speak out, stating that she refused to listen to their legal counsel, and was impossible to work with. A mistrial was declared, and Betty Broderick was retried a year later with the same defense attorney and prosecutor, and unsurprisingly, Betty would take the stand in her own defense. The following is the available footage of Betty Broderick testifying on her own behalf. Timestamps will be left in the description box if you would like to skip this portion of the video. In other videos going over cases where the accused takes the stand, I have pointed out that taking the stand at all in court is a bad move that most lawyers would suggest against. Even if you are completely innocent of any wrongdoing, going on the stand and putting yourself in the crosshairs of the prosecution can lead to you incriminating yourself and making yourself look guilty. During trial, the jury will likely be paying attention to the accused more than anyone else, and basing their judgments around the general idea of the person they are sitting across from. If you smile too much, they can think you're sadistic and unrepentant. If you seem bored, they can call you callous and uncaring. Just sitting in the court can come with unintended consequences, but the moment you take the stand, you are now put on display, and the jury can take something as little as your tone as an indicator of guilt. But in cases where the person standing trial believes themselves to be justified, or feels as if they can outsmart everyone in the room, they refuse to heed their lawyer's advice. Consider Anthony Todd, who tried to convince a jury that his wife, who he claimed was too weak to take care of herself, killed the entire family and then herself, all while telling Anthony how great of a husband and father he was. This case is a bit different, as Betty not only believes herself to be smarter than everyone in the room, she believes that killing her husband, who was asleep in bed, can be classified as an act of self-defense. Her mannerisms are not unlike Nancy Brophy and Anthony Todd, and for comparison, I will leave the videos I made discussing those trials in the description box down below.
Please state your full name for the record and spell your last name.
Elizabeth Ann Broderick. Broderick.
Pull that microphone.
Jack Early begins with the first years of Dan and Betty Broderick's relationship.
What were the discussions that you had with Mr. Broderick about being married, about getting married?
As soon as I started going out with him, he wanted to get married.
Okay. And was that something that both of you talked about?
Yes, we talked about it a lot.
And what did you tell him?
I told him that I wasn't even thinking about marriage. I had to get my college degree, and at that point I was only starting my second year of college. And he said that I could do both, that I could marry him and finish my college degree, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do it one at a time because I thought each thing was rather a full-time job.
Okay. And during the time that the two of you were dating, were you working?
Yes, I always worked.
Okay. And was Mr. Broderick working at that time?
No, I was mostly going to school and studying.
Okay. And were you in any way supporting that relationship monetarily with Mr. Broderick?
I had a lot of spending money because I had a lot of jobs and stuff, so I had social spending money. Dan only had tuition money and, his school money. So, yeah, I had a lot. Yes, I had a car, and I had disposable income, and it was my turf. He'd never been to New York before, so I knew everyone and where to go and what to do, and, yeah, I used my money.
Okay. After during the honeymoon and after you were then married, was there a change in the relationship between you and Mr. Broderick?
Yes, very much so.
And what was that change?
Well, a dating relationship is entirely different from a marriage. And during the dating relationship, I had my own job and my own money and my own car, and I lived with my parents, and I had some freedom and stuff. And after the wedding, he was in charge of everything, and I moved in with him, and he took charge of the bank books and the paychecks and everything, and I more or less had to do what he said.
Where were you living during that third year in medical school?
When we first got married, I moved into a dormitory room with Dan, which was a little teeny tiny room that adjoined another room by a teeny tiny bathroom. And it wasn't designed for two people to live in it.
Okay. When you and Dan were courting and married, was he someone you loved?
Yes, we had a lot of fun. It was very nice.
Now, during that period of time, what did you expect of a husband in marriage?
Expected him to be nice and be supportive and be the father of my children, and that we'd live happily ever after.
Now, was that a decision that you were willing to live with, him going to law school rather than going out and practice as a doctor?
Yes, that's fine with me, whatever you wanted to do.
And why was that?
Because that's a wife's job, whatever the husband wants to do, it was my job to support him emotionally and, psychologically, and great, let's do it. So we did it.
As defense attorney Jack Early carefully questions his client, she remembers when she first began to doubt her husband's actions.
And was there a reason that you discussed with Mr. Broderick the fact that he was away from the home a lot? I mean, how you felt about that? Any discussions at all?
Oh, it was constant discussions. I felt that he was really neglecting myself and the children. I felt I spoiled him in the early years by not expecting him to do anything with us because of the schooling. And then after he got a regular job, I kind of expected him to get involved and be home on weekends and be home at night and to have a little more time for us. And he didn't have very much time for us.
Jack Early questions Broderick about a church-sponsored retreat the couple went on in 1976, where they discussed and wrote down in a journal their expectations for their marriage.
And during the time that you were at the marriage encounter, did you talk about what you wanted out of a marriage?
Definitely, that's what it was for.
Okay. And what did you tell him you wanted out of a marriage?
I wanted him to spend more time with us. That's all I wanted.
Did you ever tell him what kind of physical things that you wanted?
I wanted a sofa for the family room because we had this black leather chair that he would sit in all the time, and I just didn't feel we ever got really close to one another. So yeah, I wanted a sofa for the family room. That was my big desire in 1976.
And did Dan talk to you about what he wanted
Yes.
out of the marriage?
Yes.
Or what he wanted for you? What did he tell you he wanted?
He apologized for not spending time with us and said what he needed in life were to reach these financial goals that he had set for himself way, way back. And only when he reached those financial goals would he then have time to be a nice person to me and the kids and to give us time. But I had to give him more time and stick with him until he reached those financial goals. And when he got there, then it was all going to be rosy and it was all going to pay off and it was all going to be wonderful. But I had to be patient because he had to do that first.
And did you agree at that point in time to stick it out with him and stay in California based on the things that he had promised to you?
Yes.
Did he make, at that time, any promises, inducements as to how he would be with the family, as the time he would spend with the family at home?
He was supposed to, in the book, you're supposed to make improvements, but he just further apologized and said, he'd really like to get together. You're supposed to get together 10 minutes a day after a marriage encounter to enhance the intimacy in your marriage. He said, I'd really like to do it, but I'm just too busy. I have depositions and I'm busy, and I just don't have time for this.
When is the first time that you can remember, year, if you can give it to us, where you felt that your family did not have any major financial problems, where there would actually be some discretionary spending money?
I never had any idea of what was in bank accounts or how much we owed or anything. So this is just my impression. My impression was that in 1981, Dan was purchasing and buying stuff, and so we had some money, not a lot of money, in 81, and that's the first year I felt we had any money at all.
This is blatantly untrue. Betty was incredibly aware of how well off the family was, and often made large extravagant purchases because of that. They were earning upwards of $1 million a year after Dan started work as a lawyer, and it was shown in trial that Betty would spend thousands of dollars a month on buying personal items. She was very aware of their finances, and in later interviews would admit to being in charge of a lot of their spending, as she felt Dan was too incompetent to do so. Similarly, the children would testify that their parents never kept the fact that they were wealthy away from them.
Now, at this point in time, were you also, you and Dan, doing more things socially?
The progression from 1981 to 1983 was extremely rapid insofar as money. From 1981 to 1983, by 1983 we had a lot of money.
In fact, money was to become a central issue in the divorce.
Yes.
By 1983, Broderick says she noticed a significant change in their relationship.
I wasn't even home an hour and I knew something was wrong. He didn't greet us at the door. He wasn't happy to see us. He was just acting very strange. And that was late at night when I came home with the children, and we had to go to a wedding the very next day in Laguna Beach. So we got all dressed up and drove to Laguna Beach, and it was during that ride up there that I heard what was wrong. He thought our house was tacky. He thought our friends were boring. He said that I was old, fat, ugly, boring, and stupid. And he had never said anything like that before.
Okay. At that time, were you fat?
I didn't think so.
Okay. And at that, how did you feel about yourself at that time?
Before he started saying those things, I thought I was a competent person doing the right thing in life. I was proud of my husband, my house, my family. I was very high energy. I've always been very high energy. Had lots of friends, lots of activities. I was a great cook. I was a hostess. I was pretty satisfied with how I was doing in life.
Was there a change for that in the fall of '83?
In September of '83, he came home and he said that he had hired someone, and I was very, very happy about that. I thought, whew, a release valve where he'll have more time for us and someone to help him, because he had been so grouchy and under so much pressure. And I thought it was from too much of a workload. And so he told me that he hired someone.
And did he tell you who he hired?
Yes. He told me he hired Linda Kolkina, who had formerly been the girl in the lobby of the building who answered the phones.
While Betty Broderick testifies about her disintegrating marriage, the defense is building its argument that Dan Broderick, in fact, provoked his own death. She testifies that she grew suspicious of Dan Broderick's relationship with Linda Kokina, even as he denied it, and that she became possessed with pleasing her husband.
Did you believe him when he told you at the time when you would talk to him about not having an affair with Linda Kokina?
Yes. I always believed everything he told me, and before this point in our long-term marriage, by this point, I've never doubted what he told me before. If he told me he was at meetings, he was at meetings. If he told me he was out of town at depositions, that's where he was. But all of a sudden, every time he started telling me that he was working late and he was going out of town and he was doing this and that, I was suspicious that he was with Linda Kokina and that he was lying.
This is a blatant lie. Friends and family would testify to the fact that Betty was incredibly mistrustful, not just with Dan, but with them as well. This narrative would be debunked by her own diary, which was read out in court, as well as being debunked by her own children and her friends. Prior to Linda being hired, Betty had already begun to attack Dan over his work schedule, locking him out of the house, throwing a radio, a mortar, and more at him, and demeaning him in front of the family. The very assertion that she was nothing but kind to him prior to this is blatantly false.
Did you try to do something about the things Dan said that were wrong with you?
Sure. I tried to, I wouldn't say I tried to look like Linda Kokina. I didn't do that. I just tried to not be old, fat, ugly, boring, and stupid. So I couldn't do anything about old, and I lost weight, and I went down to a sickly thin, and I didn't think I was boring, but I quit all my society things and tried to stay home and give him more attention. And I just tried to really cater to him. I tried to become perfect for him so he'd have nothing to complain about at all.
Did you do anything medically about making yourself look younger?
Dan sent me to some client that he had to get wrinkles off my face. And I got braces on my teeth because I have a little tiny crooked tooth here. I let my hair grow longer like it used to be in college. It was real long hair, and with the kids I let it get a little shorter, so I let my hair grow longer, and I just tried to look as much as I could like I used to look when I was 19.
While the family house was being prepared for sale, the Brodericks temporarily lived in a rental. Dan announced he was moving out.
And did you talk to him about did he say anything about your marriage or what was going to happen?
No. When I asked him about Linda, as I did again on April 15th, I asked him, what did he do for our anniversary? And he said he went out with someone else. He kept denying that he was even dating Linda. He never even admitted he went on a date with Linda.
But according to Broderick, they were still planning to buy a house together, and she believed the marriage could be saved. Finally, Broderick says her husband confessed.
Well, he told me the truth. He finally told me the truth.
Now, and what did he tell you?
All he wouldn't tell me any details or anything else. All he told me was I was right. I've been right all along.
And how did that make you feel?
Well, it kind of made me feel better that at least I knew the truth, but it made me feel like that he had taken really gross, unfair advantage of me for a long time, switching. Now I'm standing in this house that's empty. My kids are gone. I have no money. I have no control. I mean, it's a little late to be telling me the truth. And and then I've got all this stuff going on in my mind about typical Dan Broderick. Don't even begin negotiating till you're sitting on their chest, and knock someone to their knees. And I've been really badly used and abused by a liar for over 2 years. And I was very upset and very angry about it, and he wanted to take me to a mental institution.
This assertion that she was left with nothing when Dan left her and moved into his new home is untrue. Originally, she had full custody over the children, which she purposely gave up to try and spite Dan, and in her own words, teach him a lesson. She also had plenty of money, as Dan agreed to pay her nearly $20,000 a month, which, when adjusted for inflation, would be about $50,000 per month today. What Dan did by cheating is wrong on its own, and Betty was not and is not wrong for being upset, but she was not left destitute or without any way to take care of herself, and her children were not taken away.
That was his answer to me getting upset.
Broderick says her husband had taken over the family house with Linda Kokina and had taken the kids.
And who had custody of the children at that time?
There was no custody arrangement. They were physically living in Coral Reef because that was the only roof we had that they could be happy under and safe under. And then he got a restraining order in October of '85, and he used that as custody because if I couldn't get within 100 yards of the house where my kids were, I couldn't get to see my kids. So I didn't realize it until a long time later that that's what happened. He used the restraining order as a custody order.
The restraining order was not a custody order. The restraining order she is talking about was taken out over multiple break-ins, as well as vandalizations and abusive voicemails that were left for the family, telling them that she was going to kill them. Again, the recontextualization of the evidence is obvious. Betty cannot and will not state that the restraining orders were necessary because of her behavior, because, as she puts it, her behavior was in response to Dan just being evil. She cannot see her actions as anything but necessary, and as you will see in a second, scoffed in court when she was told that Dan was scared of her, replying, "Why would he be afraid of me?" as if she hadn't fully caused his death.
And that shouldn't have happened. I was defiant, and I did go see the kids as much as I could, but I was very scared because he was threatening to every time I came within 100 yards of my own house to see my own kids that I was liable to be thrown in jail. There were constant, everyday problems with the children. I was hysterical being separated from them. I didn't like the babysitters. I thought they weren't being cared for. I thought they were being neglected. They missed me. I missed them.
Broderick says she went to confront her husband the day she says he sold their family home out from under her.
Did you return to the house at some point in time?
Yes.
Okay, and what did you do when you returned to the house?
I bammed my car into his front door.
Okay. And when you, why did you run your car into his front door?
I was extremely hysterical. I was totally upset. I was crying. The biggest thing that bothered me was, besides the sale of the house, the biggest thing that bothered me was the way he was treating me. This is the man that was supposed to take care of us and that I trusted and all that baloney. And I went to him for answers, and the way he treated me was just so awful and so cold and just non-communicative. Like, it was just like, screw you, just die, get out of my life, go away. He had no respect for me at all.
It's striking how very little weight she gives to her ramming her car into Dan's home when her children were inside. She states that she did it because she was hysterical with how he was treating her, and that it wasn't okay how little respect he seemed to have for her. But again, by this time, she had broken into his home 3 different times, vandalized his property, broken his things, threatened to kill him, had one of their shared sons call his new girlfriend a cunt over the phone, and had told multiple people that she wanted him dead. The idea that he deserved to have a car run through his home with their children inside and potentially die, all because he wasn't respectful towards her, is not rational. If someone did to you half of the things that Betty had done to Dan, or if Dan had done to Betty half of the things she was doing to him, there would be no question who should be in jail. But Dan's responses to Betty's continued attacks were incredibly measured, to the point of him losing his life.
Then Broderick relates a series of events that she says drove her to the brink.
Now, also in 1986, did you start receiving things anonymously in the mail?
Yes.
Okay, and what sort of things did you receive?
I received a picture of Dan and Linda at a party with a sticker on it that said, "Eat your heart out, bitch."
Okay. Were there other things that you got in the mail besides that?
I would get white envelopes typewritten addressed to me with cut-out newspaper ads for wrinkle cream and weight loss clinics and things. And it was all exactly the same time as that, but separate envelopes.
Again, there is no proof of this happening. No one else, not even Betty's new boyfriend Brad, who lived with her, saw those letters. Much like the majority of Betty's statements, there's no proof to back up her claims against Dan, and we would simply have to take her word for it.
Finally, Jack Early asks about the events leading up to the killings. Betty says she received yet another legal paper about her ongoing custody dispute.
What did the letter say to you?
The letter said to me,
Don't read the letter. Just tell me what you remember the letter saying to you.
it said to me that you're going to jail, that you're going to be fined, that Linda's going to screw around with the machine again and keep you from your sons for the next 2 weeks, going to play her games again, and it's going to drive you crazy, and that's why she's doing it. It meant that that seeing the boys was going to be put off and put off and put off, and I just stood there and
I felt so sorry for my boys that they were missing everything in childhood. And I already mentioned that Danny was 13. And so, you know, the older the kids get, and we miss all these things like Halloween and stuff, those moments are forever, forever gone, and they're never coming back. And so this meant to me that I was not going to get the kids for the whole school year, probably, and that I was going to have to waste money fighting in court about stupid things, and that Dan was just going to jerk me around and mess up the money, undoubtedly, with the fines, and then...
The letter was simply asking Betty to stop leaving harassing and abusive voicemails on the family's answering machine, which is a very simple request, but Betty took it to mean everything except that.
How was your mental condition then?
I had been beaten down for so long, so many times, that I felt that all the resources a person draws on when they're in trouble, that I had over the years exhausted all those resources. I couldn't, it was 6 years into this, I couldn't call my family and say, oh, Mom, look what he's doing to me now. I couldn't turn to any friends and for help. I had already tried every civil agency in this town. I had tried child abuse. I had tried battered women. I had tried the district attorney's office for help. I had tried the city attorney's office for help. I had called the ACLU. I had called HALT. I had called NOW. I had, you know, when you're in trouble and you're looking for help and you're crying for help and screaming for help, you try all these avenues, and I had already exhausted those avenues.
She had exhausted those avenues, and they didn't work because she had no proof to her claims against Dan, and there was proof of his claims against her. She asserted that her ex-husband was turning lawyers, charities, and foundations against her, but when these groups were asked why they hadn't worked with her, they provided evidence that showed it was her own doing. During the divorce, she had hired and subsequently been dropped by 4 different attorneys before representing herself, all because she wouldn't stop harassing her ex-husband. They would tell her not to go onto his property, not to try and see the children without clearing it with the courts first, and she wouldn't listen. In her murder trial, she had done the same, and had gone through 4 different lawyers before finally finding one who would work with her. The idea that no one would help her was false. People wanted to help her, but she wouldn't allow herself to be helped. She was constantly making her life worse for herself and blaming everything on everyone else but herself.
I felt so victimized, and then I was angry, and this is all happening at once in my brain. You know, I'm explaining it one thing at a time now, but it's all happening at once, and it's like, why are they doing this? Why the hell are they doing this to me now? Why can't they just leave me alone? Why can't they let me get control of my life and get my kids and just have a peaceful, normal life? I didn't know what kind of sick jollies they were getting out of driving me crazy. And I was saying to myself, you know, what do they want out of me? What the hell do they want out of me now? What do I have that they want? And
they wanted you to stop leaving abusive voicemails threatening their lives on their answering machine. That's it.
the only answer I could come up with was that they wanted to just drive me crazy. It was sadistic what they were doing. There was nothing else that I could give these people to get away from them.
What were you going to do when you went to Dan's?
I was going to ask him for the kids and to just leave me alone. And if he wouldn't agree at all, I was just going to kill myself in his house, not down at the beach and not at my house. And I had been contemplating suicide for a long time. It's in the diaries. I was extremely despondent in what was going on in my life here because I couldn't handle it. And I knew that if I killed myself, it was going to be in front of Dan Broderick so that he couldn't just say, see, I told you she was crazy. I had nothing to do with it.
When you got to Dan's house, did you take the gun with you?
Yes.
And what was the purpose of taking that?
Every time I went to Dan's house in the past, I'd get this, 10 seconds or I'm going to call the police. Or once I got there to talk to Dan and Linda was in the window saying, you want me to call the police and stuff? So I brought the gun with me initially to make them have to talk to me. And if they said they were going to call the police, I'd say, no, you're not.
What she is describing constitutes as a hostage situation.
Did you plan to do anything if they didn't talk to you?
I told you, yes. If they wouldn't deal with me and wouldn't give me the kids, I was just going to kill myself.
Did you have in your car any keys that you thought might fit one of the doors of Dan's house?
Yes, I had a key ring with a funny-looking key on it.
Okay. Was it because of the shape of the key that you thought it was to Dan's, that it would fit Dan's house?
It was a very strange-looking key, and long before I was informed, or the kids told me, that Dan's keys were very funny-looking, and I knew Dan had funny-looking keys. It was a good chance that that was his funny-looking key.
Okay. Did you use the key to get into the house?
Yes.
Okay. And what were you going to do if the key didn't work?
Got in the house anyway. We always got in the house.
Did you want to wake Dan up when you got there? I mean, when you first got there, did you want Dan to know that you were driving up?
You're not going to admit to leading.
Sustained.
What was your feelings about Dan knowing that you got there?
I wanted him to know I was there and that I had the gun before he jumped on a phone and reported me, which is what he would have done if he saw me coming from the street or if I rang the front doorbell.
Did you ring the doorbell at all?
No.
Do you remember which door you went into?
The utility door of the house, which is mostly the traffic door.
Do you remember going driving to his house that day?
No.
And do you know what route you took?
I remember leaving my house, backing out of the driveway and leaving. I remember that, but I don't remember at which point I decided where I was when I decided not to go to the beach and go to Dan's house. All the way to Dan's house, I was just thinking, I've just got to make this stop. I just got to make this stop. I'm not going to live another day like this. I can't wake up just being absolutely at his mercy anymore. So all the way there, I just kept thinking, I've got to make this stop. I've got to make this stop. And I don't remember what even road I took to get there.
How would you describe, was it affecting you physically? I mean, were you clear thinking and seeing things clearly at that time?
The only way I can explain it.
Sustained.
How would you describe how the world seemed to you at that time?
Your Honor, it's been asked and answered.
Sustained.
Your Honor, I would like to make an offer of proof why it hasn't been.
Another question.
If I'm referring to how she was physically seeing the world at that time, it may be different than she's answered before.
All right, go ahead. You can answer that.
The only way I know how to describe it now is that there was all these thoughts just churning in my head, and there was so much going on inside my head. That's kind of like my eyeballs were turned backwards, and the whole world was inside my head because of all this anguish. And so I wasn't seeing where I was going, and it was like I was just inward, and there was all this anguish and kind of darkness and crazy thoughts. Felt like you were in hell, actually.
Okay. When you got to the house and went in the back door, do you remember where you went?
I got upstairs, I know that, but I don't know which route I took.
Okay. And when you went upstairs, do you remember where you went when you got to the top of the stairs?
The door to the bedroom was closed, but the next door was open, so I went in that door.
Okay. And where does that door lead to?
To what they call a TV room, but it's part of the bedroom suite on that side of the house.
Okay. And was anybody up at that time that you saw?
No.
Okay. Do you remember, were you holding the gun at that time?
I don't remember. I guess so.
Okay. What did, when you went into the TV room, what was the next thing that you did?
The TV room door was wide open, and then the door to their bedroom was part open. It wasn't closed. It was like ajar.
Okay. And did you then go into their bedroom?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you do when you went into their bedroom?
Well, the motion that I made, although I don't think it was a big motion, the movement that I made into their bedroom woke them up, and they moved, and somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said, "No!" And I just fired the gun, and this big noise went off, and then I grabbed the phone and got the hell out of there. But I wasn't even in that room. I mean, it just was an explosion. I moved, they moved, the gun went off, and it was like, ah! And it was that fast.
Betty was mindful enough to go into the room and yank the phone out of the wall to make sure that Dan could not call emergency services for help. That is not a quick and spontaneous decision.
I want to go through this. I want to go at least as much as we can step by step. How would you describe your memory of that event? Do you have a clear memory of everything that happened?
What I can tell you in words now is it seems like a slideshow where slides are missing. You know, I remember driving up to the front of the house. I remember the front of the house, but I don't remember if I went to the front door, and I don't remember going around. And then I know I was upstairs, and I remember opening the door to the bedroom. So I see myself doing that. But then I don't see anything else. And then I know I grabbed the phone, but I don't remember leaving the house or running down the stairs or anything. So it's like there's these spots missing. It's like a flash of this, and then she's over there, and there's a flash of that, a flash of this. And that's what I told people later is, you know, I didn't see anything in that room.
Now, when you first went into the door, do you remember do you remember what happened when you first went into the door of the bedroom?
Well, I hardly even got in. I opened the door and I stepped into the bedroom, like one step.
What did you do at that point?
Well, I was gonna say, you know, Dan, wake up, I have to talk to you.
Did you say something?
I don't know.
What happened at that point?
I walked in and they moved away from me toward the other place, and I heard Linda say, call the police.
Now, do you remember them talking to you at all? Saying something to you other than...
No, nobody said anything to me, I don't think.
Okay. And what happened when they went towards... What's the next thing you remember after they went towards the phone and said, call the police?
I kind of like screamed, like this huge scream, like, no! And the gun went off, and I just remember one time and one noise. But I know that I must have done that because you have to do that on the gun. But it was so fast. I just went, ah!
Now, did you scream out loud?
I felt like I made a huge scream, but I don't know if I made any noise. It was just all sensation. You move in, and then they moved, and then it was this huge explosion and scream and all at once.
Do you remember actually pulling the trigger?
No.
Is that a gun where you have to pull the trigger?
Yes, I asked people that day, do you have to pull the trigger? And they told me that you had to, but I don't remember pulling it even the first time.
But you remember a large bang?
Yes.
Okay. What's the next thing you remember after that?
Was grabbing the phone so that he couldn't get on it because Dan was trying to get on the phone, and grabbed the phone, and I tried to get out of the room, and it kind of jerked, and I jerked it back and pulled it out of the wall, and I think I threw it on the top of the stairs. I don't know. I may have just put it there.
Now, after you heard the boom, were you out of bullets?
I assume so, yes,
And how did you know that?
because there was no more noise and the gun was clicking.
Okay. Did you hear the gun click?
I don't remember the gun clicking, no.
Okay.
I just know that there was this huge noise and then there was no more noise.
And then after the noise, when you said the gun was clicking, was that after the noise? The clicking sound of the gun?
I guess.
Okay.
Objection, Your Honor. She stated she didn't remember any clicking.
Sustained.
Do you remember pulling the trigger after? Do you remember pulling the trigger at all?
No.
What did you, now, when you indicated, when was it that you thought about what was the thought about the phone that made you grab the phone?
Objection asked to me.
Sustained.
May I have that read back to me, Your Honor, so I can, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Was there any reason that you were scared that Dan was going to grab the phone?
Yes, because every time I went to talk to him, he'd call the police and have me arrested on the restraining order for trying to talk to him, for being within 100 yards of his house.
And now at that point in time, when you left, do you know whether anyone was hit?
No, I thought Dan was after me.
Okay. Did Dan say, do you remember Dan sitting up in bed and saying, okay, you shot me, I'm dead?
No.
Have you ever said that? Have you ever repeated that to anybody?
I know Lily says I said that. So I must have said that, but I heard Lily say I said that. I don't remember that.
Okay, and have you repeated it since then to people?
Yes,
And why was that?
because Lily said I said it, it must have happened. Or I must have said it.
Do you remember where you went after that?
Well, I had nowhere to go. I mean, I was afraid Dan was after me. I was afraid when I went into that house of confronting Dan, and then when I left, I thought he was after me. And so I thought, oh man, you can't go home because he's going to have called the police, and the police are going to be waiting at my house, and I didn't want to scare the boys and everything, so I didn't go home. So I ended up at a phone in Claremont, at a gas station in Claremont.
Do you know how long?
And I didn't know what to do or where to go or who to talk to or what to do.
Do you remember how long you drove around before you got to that gas station?
No.
How long were you at that gas station?
I still don't even know where the gas station was. It's somewhere in Claremont.
Okay, but when you arrived at the gas station, were you there very long?
I don't remember.
Did you make a call right away?
I don't remember if it was right away. I did remember, I remembered one phone number.
Okay, and did you call some people from the gas station?
I only remember dialing and calling and talking to Diane Black.
Okay. Do you remember calling Lee?
Yes, later.
Okay. When you called, where did you go from there? Did you go over someone's house?
I called Lee and I told her I was in trouble or something. I don't remember really what I told her. But I said that I'll try and get to your house. And if I don't get to your house, that means they've arrested me because the Suburban is real big and there weren't many cars out on a Sunday morning. And it has a load 'em up license plate, that's what it says, so it'd be real easy to get pulled over. And I said, if I don't arrive, honey, it's because the police got me. But I'll try and get to your house. So I went to Lee's house. And the reason for that is Dan didn't know where Lee lived. So if he was sending the cops to get me, he couldn't send them to Lee's house because he didn't know where Lee lived. Nobody knew where Lee lived except me.
When you got to Lee's house, how would you describe how you felt?
Well, whenever, especially this day, I felt bad that I was involving her, but at the same I tried to pretend like everything was okay. I guess, I don't know. I got there, I remember I took my camera out of the car, I gave her my camera, and I told her that I shot this gun at Dan's house and I have to go give myself into the police. So I took off all my jewelry and stuff, but I know I did that, but I don't remember doing it. And then I sent Lee from her apartment to go check on Danny and Rhett, because I was worried that the cops were there and that the boys were afraid and stuff. So Jason and Lee went to check on Danny and Rhett.
Did you eventually turn yourself in that day?
Yes.
And were you taken to jail after you were arrested? Were you taken
Yes,
after you turned yourself in, were you eventually taken to Las Colinas?
Yes.
Okay. And have you had conversations with a number of people since you've been in jail?
Yes.
When you first got to jail, how were you feeling?
I don't remember getting taken there. I know they put me in a suicide cell, stark naked for the first night I was there, and I was real shocking, and I don't remember being there or much of what happened. I just went where people told me to go.
Okay. Now that first day or the first couple of weeks that you were there, how were you feeling emotionally or mentally?
It's hard to just. I was very confused, but I was safe in jail. You know, they locked the rest of the world out when they locked me in this little corner cell. And that was good for me because then Dan couldn't get me.
Dan had never been trying to get her.
The first 2 or 3 months that you were in jail, were you able to come to grips with what had happened?
No. I wanted to, I wasn't able to deal with it. I wasn't able to hug my children or talk to my children. I wasn't able to go to Dan's funeral. I wasn't able to tell anybody how sorry I was that all this had happened. Anybody who was affected by it. I haven't been able to get in touch with any of the people who matter in this case.
To this day, Betty feels the murders were justified and has never apologized for killing Dan, not even to her children. In an interview she gave 3 weeks after the murder, she called Linda a bimbo and verbatim stated, "That girl had nothing on me. I am prettier, smarter, classier. She is a dumb, uneducated tramp with no background or education or talent." She has sent abusive messages to her children, claiming it's their fault that she is in prison, that they all betrayed her, and she wishes they were never born, and to this day refuses to say that she shouldn't have murdered her ex-husband. The idea that she should have gone to their funeral or would have apologized if given the chance is absurd.
Were you able to talk to the boys about what was going on?
No. Dan's brother took them out of town right away, and I was kept from them for almost 2 years, and I wasn't allowed to send birthday cards or Christmas cards. I haven't had a phone conversation, but this summer in August I was able to see them for an hour or 2, but I wasn't allowed to mention anything. I had to act like that nothing had happened. So I really want to talk to my kids about this, and to a lot of other people, but they listen to all my phone conversations and they copy every letter that goes in and out. And it's that, everyone's afraid everything will get twisted around and used against them. And so none of us have been able to deal honestly with a lot of the things that need to be dealt with.
I have no further questions, Your Honor. I do. I'm sorry, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would like a picture marked as next in order, Your Honor.
Triple I?
Yes.
Eight by 10 black and white photograph, Mr. Early?
Yes, of the defendants.
All right. Somewhere.
Showing you what has been marked triple I for identification. Is this a picture of you?
Yes.
And is this what you came to look like at the time of your arrest in 1989?
Yes.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our lunch recess.
That was the direct examination, or at least what has been made public via court TV. Betty and her lawyers attempt to make Dan's actions appear abusive. Him getting a restraining order being used to keep her from seeing her children, him treating her badly in response to her driving a car in his home, and more were all attempted to be contextualized as heinous things. But let's see how Betty fares when her narrative is held up to speculation.
Isn't it true that when you talked to Deputy Woods that you told Deputy Woods, for example, one day after testifying that it was a good day today, I had the jury eating out of my hands?
No.
Deputy Woods was the deputy that was responsible for getting you prepared and ready to come to court each day, correct?
Yes.
And are you indicating that you never had any discussions with Deputy Woods about how you were impressing the last jury?
I don't remember those discussions. I don't remember any specific discussions about that.
Do you remember talking to her about how important it was for you to give the right impression to the jury and telling her about disagreements that you had with your counsel about what kind of clothes you should wear, and the fact that wearing bright clothes wouldn't be a good impression, it would make you look too happy, and that your counsel wanted you to only wear dark clothes and drab clothes to make you look depressed?
No, Deputy Woods ended up picking out...
Excuse me, if you'd just answer my question, did you ever have any conversation like that with Deputy Woods?
No.
You have been described by people who know you well as being a good actress, haven't you?
I Never heard that.
Never heard that Dr. Jacobson, the doctor that you saw for quite a period of time, described you as a great actress?
I've never heard that he said that, no.
That you had several different personas that you could display?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this.
Sustained.
You indicated that just this morning before we broke, that you had not been able to tell anyone how sorry you were. It is true that since you've been in jail, in fact, very shortly after the time you were put in jail, that you started writing letters to people, right?
I've written letters from jail, yes.
You've written probably hundreds of letters from jail.
Maybe over the 2 years.
And even in the course of a couple of weeks to a couple of months, right after November the 5th, you wrote many letters every day to friends, to family, to newspaper reporters, to celebrities. You were writing many letters during those, let's take the 3 months after you were incarcerated, weren't you?
I don't remember specifically, but I have written letters, yes.
Well, you're not, are you disputing what I'm saying, that you have written probably at least 100 letters during that period of time?
In the 3 months after I was there, I wouldn't know. I don't know of the numbers.
Did you write many letters to your friends and to your family?
In that specific period of time?
Yes.
I don't remember in that specific period of time who I would have written to.
Did you write letters to newspaper reporters?
I corrected some articles, yes. I corrected articles that I read that were wrong.
Okay. And did you write letters to celebrities, for example?
I don't know what you're referring to.
Did you write to Cindy Garvey?
Oh, I don't remember. Did I? I don't know.
In Betty's original testimony, her responses are emotional. She is upset and she is responding emphatically. But here, much like Nancy Brophy and Anthony Tott, she focuses on the details of every question. Betty had written hundreds of letters in the first few months while in jail. She had written to multiple people, saying she regretted nothing, and stated she would be out soon to share her side of the story. She wrote countless magazines, newspapers, and publications, telling them that she was more than willing to give interviews, and she wrote to her children, telling them that she was disappointed in them that they hadn't visited her. But, being well aware that the prosecution is against her, refuses to agree with things she knows are true. Saying yes, I did write hundreds of letters in that time, is not damning, but she, wanting control over the situation at hand, will not concede. Contrasted against the direct examination, she is remarkably different.
There was nothing ever preventing you from saying anything about your feelings about what had happened in any of those letters that you wrote, was there?
No.
You were free to express your feelings about what had happened and how you felt about it, correct?
Yes.
And you had many phone calls, many phone conversations with people shortly after your incarceration, in which you were free to express your feelings about what had happened.
Well, I've already testified I wasn't free to express any feelings, really, because I knew the letters were copied coming in and going out, and that the phone calls are listened to constantly. So I was, and even the visits are listened to. So everyone was pretty paranoid about that.
You were advised that the phone calls were not monitored. Your phone calls were never monitored. And you
Oh,
were
I don't know
advised-
that.
Okay. Are you saying that you felt that you couldn't express any of your feelings about what had happened because you felt that your letters were being monitored?
Yes.
And how would that hurt you or your case to say that you felt sorry for what you had done?
How would it hurt my case to say
How did
that?
the fact that you were being monitored prevent you from expressing your feelings like you've indicated? No one would let you express your feelings.
Because it just inhibited everything. I didn't know who would interpret those and get copies and switch everything around.
So are you indicating that you felt inhibited about talking to people about what occurred?
Yes.
You did write a letter, for example, to Amy Wallace shortly after you were in jail, correct?
That would have been one of the corrections of an article, I believe.
And in that letter, you start off by saying, I have pages and pages of notes setting the story straight, incident by incident. In most cases, you have the general idea, but the chronology and the facts are all twisted around. I'll call. We can talk. Neighbors and friends have bits and pieces. Only I know the whole truth. Are you saying that you were inhibited about telling her the whole truth as you saw it?
I was just correcting her article. Whatever she said that I felt was wrong, I wanted corrected.
Okay. Are you saying that you were inhibited about saying anything that you wanted to correct anything that had been written about you?
Yes, because I wouldn't have expressed the feelings that I'm talking about to a strange newspaper reporter.
While we're on the subject, we'll come back, but when you say that you were correcting things that had been written. In fact, you made a specific correction with Amy Wallace about what Dan Broderick had said after you shot him. You indicated that Lee, who had testified that he said, okay, you shot me, I'm dead. You called up Amy Wallace and you told her, no, that's not right. That's not what he said. He said, okay, you got me, I'm dead,
Right,
correct?
right.
Didn't you just testify before lunch that you didn't remember him saying anything to that effect?
I didn't remember him sitting up in bed and saying anything like that, no.
You don't remember testifying last time?
But I remember,
Excuse me. Do you remember testifying the last time you testified that he put his hands up and he said, okay, you got me?
yes.
Didn't you just testify earlier today that you didn't remember him saying anything like that?
Well, I don't know. What I really testified to is I don't really know what happened in that room. It was all these flashes of things.
Excuse me, you answer the question. Let me just ask you this. If you don't really know what happened in that room, how was it you could write or call Amy Wallace and correct her about what had been said about what happened in that room?
Because at that time, way back then, I thought Dan said that.
Okay, so way back then, when you talked to Amy Wallace back in March of 1990, you had a clear recollection then of what had occurred in that room. Is that what you're saying?
No. In March, no. When Lee said that in the very beginning, in November, that I said that, we discussed it. I said, I couldn't have said that because she said I didn't know if I shot anybody, so he couldn't have said that.
Did you not call up Amy Wallace and tell her, correct her? He didn't say, you shot me, correcting one of her daughters. He said, okay, you got me.
Your Honor, that's been
Okay.
answered.
Sustained.
You called Amy Wallace anyway to correct what your daughter had said, is that correct?
Your Honor, asked and answered.
Overruled, you can answer that, yes or no.
Yes, I guess, if you said I did.
And you talked to her about several corrections that you thought that had been in the press that you didn't think were correct, and you wanted to correct the record, right?
Yes.
And Amy Wallace was not the only reporter that you talked to shortly after committing these crimes, correct? You talked to many reporters.
I don't
Is that
remember
true?
if I talked. Other reporters came to talk to me.
Have you
John
given-
Gaines, I've spoken to John Gaines, but I don't know when that started.
Okay, you've indicated you've given interviews to John Gaines from the San Diego Union, correct?
Last year, yes.
And you gave an interview, or several interviews, to Alan Abrahamson from the LA Times, correct?
On the telephone?
On the telephone or in person? Did you give an interview with Alan Abrahamson?
I've spoken to him, yes.
And you've talked to Irene Schaefer from the La Jolla Light?
Oh, Irene doesn't work at the La Jolla Light.
Okay. Did you talk to Cynthia Queen from the La Jolla Light?
Yes.
And you talked to a reporter from the New York Times?
Yes.
And you talked to a reporter, author who wrote an article in the Ladies' Home Journal?
I don't really remember
Kathleen
if I
Newmeyer?
spoke to her on the phone, maybe in New York.
You talked to Joyce Wadler from People Magazine?
No,
Did you give an interview to anyone from People
it
Magazine?
was a man.
Okay. Lorenzo Bennett?
I think that was his name, yes.
And in none of those interviews, those people have all written articles about what you've said. In none of those interviews did they ever say that you expressed any remorse for these killings, did they?
I don't know.
Are you indicating that you expressed remorse to these people and they didn't, and they said the opposite in their reports?
The remorse that I'm talking about was, what I was sorry for was to Dan's parents, to Dan's brothers and sisters and stuff. I haven't spoken to those people.
Was there
To
anything that
Linda's family, I haven't spoken to them.
Mrs. Broderick, was there anything that prevented you from writing a letter to any of Dan's family or parents or any of Linda's family since the time that you committed these crimes?
Yes.
When you talked to the author from People Magazine, which was just last month, isn't it true that you indicated absolutely no remorse, that Linda knowingly dated a married man, that you felt equally unconcerned about the death of your ex-husband? I wasn't the one who had the affair. I won't accept the blame for what happened. Didn't you say that?
I don't remember specifically saying that. If he says I said it. I said it.
This just in, person only remembers things that make them look good. Betty refuses to acknowledge anything she has said or done in this case that makes her look anything but good. She couldn't have contacted Dan or Linda's family to express remorse, because her mail was being monitored. But she could contact celebrities and reporters to express that Dan and Linda had it coming. She couldn't remember that she told the deputy in charge of getting her ready for the trial that she was advised against wearing bright colors and smiling too much, as that can make her look bad to the jury, because that it would seem that she didn't care. Again, if something doesn't fit in Betty's perception of herself, which is that she is a good person who means well, she refuses to admit that she even did it. If she did it, there had to be a good reason. Pay attention to how often she forgets what she has said or done, and how it only seems to happen when things make her look bad.
Would you like me to show it to you to see if it refreshes your recollection?
No, I'm sure if it's written there, it says it.
You didn't have just one interview with Amy Wallace. You had numerous interviews with her, correct? Before she wrote a large article about you?
This was in the very beginning, so I would have talked to her. I don't remember how many times she might have come there, or I mostly talked to her on the phone, I think.
Is it correct when she describes that over the next 6 months you called and wrote often, always eager to talk?
Sure, I don't know.
I'm just asking you if that's a correct indication of how many times you talked.
6
to Amy
months from
Wallace.
when it happened to when she wrote the article.
Yes?
Probably yes.
And she too indicated in her article that described you as being intelligent, angry, and without remorse.
Were those her words?
Yes?
Well, if that's what she thought, that's what she thought.
Well, are you indicating that you indicated something different to her? That you expressed remorse
She
to her?
didn't give me an intelligence test. She didn't know if I had any remorse. Those are her words. She didn't know if I was any of those things.
Well, she described that when she talked to you the very first meeting, that you insisted that all your actions were justified. You said, quote, "He went off with the bimbo at 40 driving a red Corvette. Haven't we heard this before?" Did you say that to Amy Wallace?
I did say that.
You also told Amy Wallace that you were upset that people were mourning Dan and Linda. Didn't you?
I was upset at the way that the funeral was handled, yes.
You said it always makes me mad when people call them the victims. You're tired of hearing people mourn Dan and Linda. Did you say that?
I thought the way the funeral was handled was wrong.
And it wasn't that you were upset that you couldn't go to the funeral. What you were upset about, and that you expressed to several people, was that Dan had gotten full rights in the Catholic Church, and you didn't think that was appropriate because he was divorced.
No, I was very upset I didn't go to the funeral. I would have handled the funeral extremely differently, however.
Did you tell Amy Wallace that all of your actions were justified?
Referring to which all of my actions? I don't know. If she
Did
said
you
it
ever
was a
make that
quotation,
statement to Amy Wallace that all of your actions were justified?
I don't know.
And when you were in jail, you also made statements similar to the ones that you made to Maria Peralta. You made statements like that to other people. It wasn't just Maria Peralta that you talked about your feelings about Linda, correct?
Excuse me?
Did you make statements about your feelings about Linda to other people in jail?
I guess so. I mean,
But did you tell Deputy Woods, for example, similar to what you said to Maria Peralta, that Linda was, quote, "a fucking bitch. She was living in my house, driving my car, sleeping in my bed."
Your Honor, all
Let's
it assumes facts, not evidence.
Sustained.
I'm asking her if she said that.
Your Honor, it assumes facts, not evidence that those are Maria Peralta's words.
No, excuse me, I'm talking about a statement you made to Deputy Woods.
Rephrase it.
Did you make a statement to Deputy Woods that Linda is a fucking bitch, she was living in my bed, driving my car, sleeping in my bed?
no, because those are not true, and I didn't make them to Maria Peralta, and I didn't make them to Deputy Woods.
Did you appear to Deputy Woods to be happy about what you had done and that you were going to get off?
During the 2 years that I've been there, I've appeared to be happy, I've appeared to be sad, I've appeared to be upset. If I appeared a certain way to Deputy Woods at a certain time, I'm sure during certain times I was there, I appeared to be happy, but she may not have known why.
In relation to killing Dan and Linda Broderick, did you appear to be happy about it?
No.
How about to Dr. Robinson, the psychiatrist that was there at Los Colinas Jail?
I don't even know Dr. Robinson.
Dr. Robinson, he's a black gentleman, often wears a cap on his head.
I've never met Dr. Robinson. Never seen a man of that description.
Well, you've indicated that you've been happy at times in jail. In fact, you gave an interview to Alan Abrahamson where you told him that you wanted the world to know how happy you were in jail, right? Do you remember doing that?
I don't know if those were my words.
Do you remember telling him that you wanted everyone to know that you were doing fabulously well, that it's been wonderful? Prison is a country club?
No, because I was never in prison. I wouldn't have said prison was a country club.
Would you have said that prison is a country club, a tennis court, swimming
Your Honor,
pool?
I'm going to object. It's irrelevant.
Sustained.
Would you have said anything to him about the fact that being in jail was early retirement?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Irrelevant.
Overruled. You can answer that. It's yes or no.
Maybe.
Would you have said to him that you don't have to worry about your car getting fixed, I can read, I can write, I can converse with people, no responsibilities?
There was a period of time after the first...
Excuse me, did you make that statement to Alan Abrahamson?
I may have.
And would that have been approximately March of 1991? Does that sound right to you?
Yes, it would be in the period I was trying to tell you about.
If you have grown up in the South, you know that this is a bless your heart face. It's a face of a person who is talking down to you, but in a tone of false kindness. And this is why putting someone like Betty on the stand is always a bad idea. Betty is getting angry. The statements that are being made about her, to her, are all truthful, but they go against her perception of herself and how she wants the court to view her. The fact that she is not allowed to give full, detailed responses in order to make those statements seem justified is upsetting to her, and in order to try and express that anger, she has donned a false smile. This smile comes across as angry and demeaning, which goes against the fragile wife and mother she had claimed to be originally. If it's noticeable to us, it is no doubt completely transparent to the jury.
I want to back up and ask you a few questions about some of the things you said when you were describing your early married years with Mr. Broderick. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. You testified that during the time that you were in law school, or that Dan Broderick was in law school, you described an apartment that you lived in, and you described this very ugly, rotten place that you had to live in outside of Cambridge, correct?
Correct.
You didn't tell us about the fact that during the second and the third year of law school that you moved out to a very nice suburb in Marlboro and lived in a very nice apartment during
No, I
those
did
years.
state that.
Objection. That is argumentative.
Sustained.
I said it had to do with getting a car, remember?
Okay.
Because we didn't have a car in the beginning, and I said we got a car, and then we moved.
And during the second and third year then, you lived in a very nice apartment complex in a very nice suburb, is that correct?
Different places, because we had to move out in the summer to go to LA and come back to a different place. 2 different apartment complexes in Marlboro, Massachusetts, correct.
And it was about 40 miles away from Cambridge. Dan had to commute about 40 miles every day on his motorcycle to go to law school so that you and the children could be in a nice suburb, correct?
Yes, I remember I said that. We had an apartment above ground.
Okay. And during that time, you had indicated, and you can correct me obviously if I'm wrong, but you indicated that you were totally isolated from people when you were living during those years in law school, correct? Didn't you say that?
Well, what kinds of people? There were other people living in the apartments that were adjacent to ours. I didn't know their names, and I didn't spend time with them, and I never met them. So I was not physically, there were other people there. I didn't happen to know them.
You testified that you were isolated, though, from,
Yes, I
from
felt-
friends and people during the second, third year of law school?
I felt isolated, yes.
Isn't it true that you lived very close to a couple of good friends, the McAuliffes, who came over and visited you almost every weekend?
That was Dan's friend and his wife. Yes, we knew those people.
Jiggs McAuliffe and Sandy McAuliffe, they were good friends of yours as well, weren't they?
They became friends, yes.
And they would come over just about every weekend. They would visit. Dan and Jiggs would take care of the kids so that you and Sandy could go out shopping and have free time together, right? Now, you said that one of the things that you were really looking forward to after you got married, one of the goals you had was to get to Europe, right?
Right.
Okay. And you did get to Europe. In 1981, you were able to take a trip to Europe with Dan.
Right.
And then in 1983, you were able to take another trip to Europe with Dan.
Right.
So you reached those goals as far as things that you've been looking forward to do with Dan. When was it that you took the Caribbean cruise with Dan?
Dan and I never took a Caribbean cruise.
Did you ever go to the Caribbean with Dan?
We went to the Caribbean on our honeymoon to St. Thomas.
Okay. Did you go to a trip to the Bahamas in the 1980s ever?
No.
How about a trip to Cancun?
Yes, that was a Club Med trip into Mexico.
And a trip to Alisal?
That was the family trip to a ranch before we joined Warner's, yes.
And when was that trip to Alisal?
That was when I had 2 broken arms, so whenever we can put that in there.
It was in the late 70s?
No, it would have been after Rhett was born, so it was 80 or 81.
You said, you described the fact that Dan Broderick wouldn't let you be involved in the financial decisions and that he was very dictatorial about that. Isn't it true that you have previously said that you happily let him take over all of the decisions?
I've always said that, yes.
Okay. You said not being involved in the money saved me from a lot of anxiety, saved me from a lot of worrying.
That's exactly right, it did. And
So
I
that
never
was-
argued with that arrangement when we were married.
Okay. So it wasn't that Dan was being dictatorial and telling you that you couldn't have anything to do with the finances. It was something that you wanted him to take care of.
Well, I never asked him to do it, no. It was an unspoken agreement in our marriage from day one that he would handle the rent and the insurance and all those things. And it's what he called, women's work and men's work. I mean, that was the man earned the wages and paid the bills, and the woman took care of the food and the laundry and the children in the house, and never the twain shall meet. I didn't touch anything to do with the money, and he never had anything to do with the laundry or the kids or the food. That was women's work. But I did not argue with that arrangement.
And you were happy about that arrangement. That was an
was
arrangement
our
that you wanted.
arrangement, and it worked well for a very long time, yes. I did not argue about it.
You also indicated that Dan had always been an extremely hard worker, right?
Very much so, yes.
Always, from the
That's
very
right.
beginning.
Medical school, law school, everything.
Okay. So, and you described that he basically worked 7 days and nights a week. He'd fall asleep at night with a legal file in his chest and wake up in the morning and do it again.
Absolutely. Even when he was a student, he worked that hard.
So during the marriage, he wasn't out there squandering your money. He wasn't losing it in Vegas. He wasn't womanizing. He was providing for you and the children and the family.
Yes,
correct?
we both worked very hard, and we did without a lot for many years so that he could get his, yes. Those are all correct statements.
You indicated just recently this morning, I think, about how you were upset that you weren't able to realize some of the things that you had wanted, for example, a boat and the piano. I mean, those were all things that you had prior to separation, right?
Those were not the things that I wanted. Those were in Dan's marriage encounter as the list of things that he wanted as his possessions and material goals, I think he called them.
And you've talked about that by 1981, which would have been 4 years before you separated, You basically, at that point, had an unlimited budget. You had...
No, not 81. That was 83. 81 is, the testimony was that was the first year we had any money, and by 82 we had nice money, and by 83, between 81 and 83, by 83 we had tons of money. So between 81 and 83 is when we started getting money. Before that, we had no money at all to speak of.
In 1979, when Dan Broderick was making $82,000 a year, you had no money to speak of?
When he was on his own, and he had the expenses of, was that the corporate thing or the personal thing?
In 1979, when his personal income was $82,000 a year, you indicating you had no spending money?
Right.
I would like to...
I wouldn't have known that's what his income was anyway.
Before there's cross-examination, I'd like to see documents that support this.
He has discussed those documents.
You got it in your hand? Show it to me.
Sure. In fact, it was 1979 that you put a pool in the house at Coral Reef, correct?
Yes, we got another mortgage on the house to do that. I think we did.
And did you not tell Jeanette DeWise, who you also interviewed with from the Reader, that by 1981 you felt you had an unlimited budget, you had a closet full of $2,000 dresses, you had a $10,000 formal gown?
No.
Dan had bought. When did Dan buy you the Lynx fur jacket?
I don't remember.
You don't remember? Okay.
No, I don't.
So it could have been at that period of time then.
But what you said previous was 80 after 83. If I thought I've always said the same thing. In 81, we started having money. That's why we went to Europe. But we went to Europe and switched houses and got you rail passes. It wasn't what you'd call a luxury
I understand.
trip.
You've explained that. I
Okay,
understand.
so what you just said that I said to someone in 81 is incorrect. That's not right. I didn't have those things in 81.
Your Honor, I may have marked as People's Exhibit next in order.
66?
66, a two-page document which indicates gross income of both Dan Broderick and Elizabeth Broderick for the period of time of 1969 through 1984.
Somewhere.
Do you recall being shown this document during the course of the divorce trial,
No,
summarizing the income?
no.
Did you put your income on income tax reports?
I had nothing to do with income taxes. If Dan did put something of mine on there, then Dan did it, but I didn't file separate income tax.
Why don't you
We had
take
an
a look at,
accountant.
why don't you take a look at those figures and tell me if you think that those are accurate figures regarding income?
Dan made this list up, right?
This was a list that was introduced into evidence, and I'd just like you to tell me whether you think that they're accurate or not.
I wouldn't have any way of knowing.
You had no way of knowing how much money you made?
Well, I think my teaching job was $7,000 a year, so he's got down here in 69, I made $6,200, so that's close. In 1970, Gordon Taylor,
If you, ma'am, if you could just read them to yourself and let me know if you think they're accurate.
I don't know how he ever could have, I have no idea. I don't know how he ever came to a figure on what I made babysitting, because I never kept records.
Okay.
But in the beginning, it looks okay.
You have described your marriage to lots of different people over the course of the years, right?
During the course of what years?
During the course of...
My life?
Yes, during the course of your life.
No.
During the course of after your separation, you've made lots of statements to different people
Yes,
about
after the separation.
your marriage.
Right.
And you have, for example, told people, like Mr. Hargraves, who was representing you, that your marriage to Dan was the most ideal marriage of any couple. You were very happy with Dan. Did you make that statement to Mr. Hargraves?
At times, yes. Yes, I believed that.
And you told Dr. Goldsband that we had a wonderful marriage. Is that it?
I thought so. I thought we did.
You told Dr. Robinson we had an ideal marriage until Linda came along?
Yes, probably. Dr. Robinson, I don't even remember meeting him, though.
Okay. Did you tell Dr. DeFrancesca that you were always happy and that you had a happy marriage until Linda came along?
Right. I would have said that probably.
Well, when was it, I'm a little confused. When was it that you started describing your marriage as being rotten from the beginning?
Exactly at the time you're on. When we separated, I then withdrew my consent for Dan Broderick being in control of everything. Until that point, I totally consented in our marriage to our agreement that he was in charge of everything. And when he walked...
Excuse me, wait a minute. Perhaps you misunderstood my question. When you talked to Dr. Goldsband, for example, that was in 1990. That was after you killed Dan and Linda Broderick. And when he asked you to describe the marriage, you described it as a wonderful marriage, right?
I thought it was. It was a very unequally structured marriage, but I went along with it, and I was happy when it was like that.
Well, how is it that you, at other times, described to other people that the marriage was a disaster from day one?
Dan was a control freak, and he had control in his marriage. As long as I didn't fight it, it was okay with me.
Okay, but if we're talking about after separation, let's say you've already separated. You already know now what you think about the marriage. When you talk to Dr. Goldsband, when you talk to Mr. Hargraves during the divorce, when you talk to Dr. DeFrancesca, when you talk to Dr. Robinson, you described your marriage as being a wonderful, ideal marriage.
As long as it worked, it was. As long as I went along with this ridiculous plan that I was in, it worked. It wasn't fair.
You didn't qualify that at all when you talked to these people. You said it was a wonderful, ideal marriage until Linda came along.
The prosecution is pointing out inconsistencies, but Betty refuses to acknowledge them. By pointing out she has previously said that their relationship was perfect in every way until Linda came along, the prosecution is showing how Dan was not evil or the abusive alcoholic that she had characterized him being. Saying that the marriage was horrible all the way through and was rotten by day one obviously conflicts with her saying it was ideal, but Betty is now trying to say those things mean the same thing. She had since claimed the entire marriage was horrible, that she hated being married to Dan from the moment she was, but has also said the opposite. Through multiple interviews, letters, and statements, she had both said she loved being married and hated it, but she is about to say why.
That's right, so.
Okay. Didn't you also write in your book that the marriage was a disaster from day one?
Looking back from the vantage point of where I wrote the book in 1988, and I think I've already testified to that on the ski trip when I was suicidal and depressed. I wrote that book as a memoir in case I killed myself, so my children would know what happened. And I was very angry at that point that it's 88. I still have no settlement. I've been put through everything. And
Wasn't it 1986 when you talked to Bill Hargraves, when you were going through the divorce, when you were angry about things, when you still told him you had the most ideal marriage of any couple?
But that was...
Object is argumentative, and if she can allow her to finish her previous answer before she asks another question.
Overruled and argumentative, it's asked and answered to stand on that grounds. Go ahead.
Was it 1986 when you made that statement to Mr. Hargraves?
Yes, but that fits together because in 1986 I still hadn't despaired in the legal system and in everything else as I did by the point of 88.
So your anger at Dan Broderick after the separation is what made you change your feelings about whether or not you'd had a good marriage before the separation, correct?
Right.
But Betty didn't change her mind in hindsight. She changed her mind depending upon who she was talking to and the situation. To some, Dan was a loving and supportive man who wanted to give her and her kids the world until he was seduced by a young harlot. And to others, he'd been abusive since day one of their marriage and she was forced to stay. These statements are both given after the murder, and seeing as these two things conflict, they can't be true at the same time.
It is true that you had discussed divorce on many occasions with Dan Broderick during the course of your marriage.
I don't know. No, we didn't discuss divorce.
You
It was
threatened divorce on many occasions.
the same way I've been said to have threatened to kill him. Yes.
Well, you didn't just threaten to kill him, you did kill him.
Well, and we did get a divorce.
Yes. And you threatened divorce even in the first year of your marriage, didn't you?
And probably to kill him in the first year of my marriage, too. Yes.
You threatened to leave him when he was in law school, correct?
When Dan beat up Kim and I left and went to New York, yes, I was going to leave him.
Was there anybody else around when Dan allegedly beat up Kim, Mrs. Broderick?
No.
Your Honor, I'm going to object as argumentative.
Overruled, that's a proper question.
Kim states that her father never beat her up and this never occurred.
Answer stands.
And so now you're saying that Dan beat up Kim, that you left him, but you still had a wonderful marriage.
Your Honor, I'm going to object as argumentative.
Sustained.
It is fair to say you would even have to admit yourself in fairness that Dan Broderick's description of your marriage and your relationship and whether or not you were happy was significantly different than your description, wasn't it?
When was Dan describing it? After the affair and after the separation and into the divorce? Or are you talking that he was describing it as it was happening when we were both happy?
Hasn't Dan described that you were never happy with him, that you were always volatile, that he felt emotional problems from the very beginning?
That's what he was telling you.
As to that question.
Overruled, the answer stands.
He has described that, correct?
In the same
The
way
answer
I
is-
was writing the book in 88, he was telling people in 88 and 89, he was trying to rationalize why we'd gotten divorced and he had the affair. And that's how he would explain things, yes.
Well, he described, you
never
got very
earlier.
angry at him at the divorce trial because he tried to describe his feelings about the marriage and how it had been very difficult from the very beginning and how he was never able to make you happy and how he felt that your temper was out of control and that you had had emotional problems from the beginning, that you had both tried to keep it together because of your Catholic background, because of the children that you had from the beginning.
He was making all of that up from the vantage point that he wanted it to appear that way in 1989.
So you're saying he was making all that up from his vantage point, but you're not making any of this up from your vantage point.
No,
Is that
I'm
what
not
you're
saying that. I'm saying my vantage point changed drastically over the years as to who I was talking to, as to what I was feeling at the time, and what I was talking about in the marriage.
Dan's assertions that their marriage was difficult was parallel to Betty's assertions, but Betty states that when Dan said these things, he was lying, as he was trying to justify the divorce and him cheating. Her stating that these assertions weren't true and were made out of necessity actually hurt her case, because had she said I disagree as to why our marriage was bad, and I feel like we both had issues that we couldn't work out, it would have made her appear more reasonable. If you have ever been in an argument with someone and they refuse to take any sort of accountability as to how they made you feel, you likely know how infuriating it can be. They will hold you responsible for the way your words and actions have made them feel, but when you try to do the same, they refuse to accept that, saying that what you're saying isn't definitively true, or that they simply don't remember it that way, and saying that you're being unfair to them. It seems that the only way Betty can view herself in the marriage is through the lens that she had done everything right. She was faithful and loving to her husband, and in her mind, there was no reason for him to think anything less of her. But, according to her own statements, that was not the case. By taking some accountability, by saying that was his viewpoint of our marriage, and I had my own issues with it as well, she would be giving herself more credibility. But instead, after saying their marriage was horrendous, but also perfect, she is unable to admit that her ex-husband might have had reasons outside of infidelity to divorce her.
Answer stands.
And so now you're saying that Dan beat up Kim, that you left him, but you still had a wonderful marriage.
Your Honor, I'm going to object as argumentative.
Sustained.
It is fair to say you would even have to admit yourself in fairness that Dan Broderick's description of your marriage and your relationship and whether or not you were happy was significantly different than your description, wasn't it?
When was Dan describing it? After the affair and after the separation and into the divorce? Or are you talking that he was describing it as it was happening when we were both happy?
Hasn't Dan described that you were never happy with him, that you were always volatile, that he felt emotional problems from the very beginning?
That's what he was telling me.
As to that question.
Overruled the answer stands.
He has described that, correct?
In the same
The
way
answer
I
is-
was writing the book in '88, he was telling people in '88 and '89, he was trying to rationalize why we'd gotten divorced and he had the affair, and that's how he would explain things, yes.
Well, he described, you
never
got very
earlier.
angry at him at the divorce trial because he tried to describe his feelings about the marriage and how it had been very difficult from the very beginning and how he was never able to make you happy and how he felt that your temper was out of control and that you had had emotional problems from the beginning, that you had both tried to keep it together because of your Catholic background, because of the children that you had from the beginning.
He was making all of that up from the vantage point that he wanted it to appear that way in 1989.
So you're saying he was making all that up from his vantage point, but you're not making any of this up from your vantage point?
No,
Is that
I'm
what you're
not saying that. I'm saying my vantage point changed drastically over the years as to who I was talking to, as to what I was feeling at the time, and what I was talking about in the marriage.
She wasn't qualified for the job, which is why she wasn't hired. She would go on to say that Dan had told them not to hire her, as she had applied and interviewed for the position, but now denies that that happened on the stand.
It never happened.
Did you describe it at all to Liz Armstrong?
No, it never happened. Nothing even, sometimes people get confused and there's a thread of truth and I can put it together where, they were confused. Nothing like that ever happened, except years earlier before the split up, I went to an interview at Merrill Lynch and the man was very rude to me and said that it was a job for men and that I had children and that I should basically go home and take care of my children. And I figured if I wanted to, I could have sued him. He was so rude. But I never took a test. They never offered me a job. Nothing ever came of it.
Just so that it's clear, you're indicating that you never had a conversation with Liz Armstrong about applying for a job with Dean Wetter, and that you never got the job because you refused to go through the training program and refused to work on a commission basis? Never had that discussion with Liz Armstrong?
I read that Liz Armstrong said those things. Those things never happened, not even close. Nothing even like it ever happened. I'm telling you, if they had offered me a job, I would have taken it.
One of the other things that you said during the course of your testimony was that after the separation, that Coral Reef was the only asset that had your name on it. And that's one of the reasons why you were so upset that it got sold. It was the only asset that had your name on it. You were aware of the fact that you had your name on, for example, the Warner Springs condo. You were aware of that, weren't you?
I'm not sure that I was aware that my name was on that, but...
Well, you knew of that asset. You knew of
That is not an asset, though. That was not an asset at the time, and it's not an asset now.
Well, an asset is worth some money, right? Are you saying Warner Springs was worth no money?
When we had it for all the years, we were one of the very first investors, and it was unsaleable, yes, at any price.
After the separation?
Yes.
You were aware of the Fairbanks Ranch lots, and you knew that your name was on those lots, and those were definitely an asset.
The Fairbanks Ranch lot that had my name on it was sold before the separation, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But the other Fairbanks Ranch lot was owned by the pension fund of Dan's Law Corporation, and it did not have my name on it.
What about Pioneer Park? You knew about Pioneer Park?
No, I didn't know about Pioneer Park.
You knew nothing about that investment with Helen Picard and her husband?
No, I didn't.
What about the Keystone condo? You knew about
Didn't
that?
have my name on it.
The Keystone condo didn't have your name on it?
No, it wasn't. It didn't even actually have Dan's name on it.
Well, you knew that it was a community asset. You knew that you
But
had
that's
bought
totally
that.
different. Yes, I knew that everything we owned, in theory, was a community asset. But insofar as having my name on it and knowing how much it was worth, or having any paperwork, or being able to sell it, or know how much it was worth, none of those things had my name on them. And even if
Whether or not they had your name on it, you knew that they were community assets. You knew that Coral Reef was not the only community asset that was being sold, correct?
Coral Reef was the only community asset that I knew about that was worth money, because we had 10 years worth of equity, and that I could see and I knew about that had my name on it legit. Other things that had my name on them, I had no paperwork for, and perhaps I put my name on them as a formality. But insofar as knowing where the paperwork was or who owned it or who bought it, no. I had no participation in any other purchases.
And you've also testified that you knew nothing about any of the investments that Dan Broderick made with his brother Larry.
At which time are you saying I knew nothing? At
Right.
separation?
You testified at separation.
At separation, I didn't know about those things.
You knew that you had your name on the Calle de Cielo house.
Yes, but I also knew it had no equity.
Well, it had $143,000 worth of equity in it.
But that's not really equity when you're talking...
$143,000 doesn't sound like equity?
I don't think so, if you consider 6% real estate, whatever, to sell it. And when you buy a new house and the down payment isn't really enough equity, so that if you sold the house and went through the taxes and the fees and the points and whatever you do, you wouldn't have ended up with any money out of that house.
It is true that since the separation, you have variously described Dan in pretty derogatory terms with respect to how he was when you met him, correct?
Yes.
You described him, for example, as being a pathetic bumpkin.
I thought he looked like a nerd in the wedding picture now, but then he thought he was sharp looking. And I obviously did too. I married him.
After the separation, did you describe him, though, as being a pathetic bumpkin and a nerd and having no social awareness, and that you were the one that gave that all to him?
I said all kinds of ugly things every chance I got, yes.
And during the marriage, before you separated, you said some ugly things about him in front of other people, too. You called him a fag, you called him an asshole. You made derogatory comments about him in front of other people, didn't you?
The Broderick family calls everybody fags all the time.
Mrs. Broderick, did you call him a fag in front of other people at parties and social functions?
Probably, and I probably called him an asshole, sure.
Wasn't it your testimony that you never used bad language till after the separation?
I used shit and damn and stuff, but not around the kids.
An asshole?
An asshole, but I didn't consider that bad language in the text that I was using and stuff.
And you didn't consider it hurtful at all to say things like that or to put him down in front of other people?
It depends on where we are and who we're with and what he's doing.
Well,
I mean,
for
sometimes
example,
he was doing things and it was just funny.
For example, when you went to Lake Tahoe with the Forbes and a couple other groups of people, you recall that one of the couples there basically felt extremely uncomfortable because you were constantly putting Dan down and saying uncomfortable things and making them feel uncomfortable.
Now, what year would that have been?
1981.
I know that you interviewed someone who in 1989 or 90 or 91 said something like that, but I never knew back then. She's referring to the same weekend Brian Forbes mentioned. And Brian Forbes mentioned it in the context of what a hard worker Dan was. We went away on this weekend with tennis and swimming and boats, and Dan brought legal files this high, and he sat there with a highlighter pen while everyone else was playing tennis and having fun. He was working on the weekend. And so I was annoyed with him for either, do one or the other, but I wished he hadn't have brought all that work with him on the weekend.
Anytime the prosecution brings up a statement or comment made by another party that makes Betty look bad, she attempts to correct them and states that they were referring to something else entirely. She never said she applied to work at an investment firm after divorcing Dan. That person must have been thinking about years earlier. This person wasn't recalling her demeaning her husband while on vacation with a couple. They were thinking of another time entirely where the situation didn't make her look as bad. And yet she can still not recall what she said to the deputy sheriff during the first trial, or how many letters she wrote mere months ago. It also bears noticing that Betty's reactions have become almost comical on the stand. She doesn't simply roll her eyes. She rolls her eyes, raises her hands, and makes a face in order to show how annoyed she is. She is acting cartoonishly exasperated in order to express how uncomfortable she is, with the hope that the jury begins to view the prosecution as being callous and unkind to her.
Well, you were obviously annoyed enough that you were making other people feel uncomfortable and making comments to the effect that they didn't think your marriage would last the year.
She made that in 1991.
Facts, not in evidence, in this argument.
Were you aware of the fact that she made that comment to Gail Forbes back then in 1981?
How would I know? No.
It is true that when you had disagreements or complaints that you didn't have any problems sharing those complaints with Dan Broderick.
About what, when?
If you got angry, for example, you didn't have any problems throwing a ketchup bottle at him.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Did you throw a ketchup bottle at him?
That was not even an argument. Neither one of us were arguing with each other at that time. Kim was not there. None of the children were there. Dan came home from work. Let me tell you the little story. Dan came home from work. He's sitting at the dining room table and he's teasing me. And I'm like, cut it out, cut it out, cut it out. You probably called him an asshole way back then. Cut it out. I'm really tired. Please cut it out. And he wouldn't cut it out. And he was joking with me. He was teasing me. I said, if you don't cut it out, I'm going to throw this at you. And then he went, whatever he was teasing me about, he did it again on purpose. I threw it at him and he ducked. And it was funny. And it didn't break and it didn't do any damage. And Dan and I told that story on ourselves to other people. I mean, we told how funny it was.
Kim wasn't there and wasn't upset about it, the fact that the ketchup splattered all over the wall.
That's not true. No. I wish Dan was here to tell you the truth.
So do I.
So do I.
That might be a good.
Imagine killing someone and saying, I wish they were here to tell you the truth, then making this face, which is just ghoulish and spooky.
In 1978, Dan Broderick deciding to leave the firm of Gray Carey and go out on his own. And it is correct that that was something, he didn't just do that unilaterally, basically tell you, I don't care whether we have any security or not, I'm going to do this on my own. That was something that you had urged him to do, correct?
It's even discussed in the marriage encounters in '76 that that's our plan as a couple together, that we will do that. Yes.
Okay. So, and that was something that he had uncertain feelings about. That was something that you pushed him into doing. He wasn't really sure whether he wanted to do it, and that was something that you encouraged and you pushed, correct?
Well, he was sure he wanted to do it, but it was a very scary move. It was a very scary move, and so he was looking for reassurance that yes, I'm in it with you, and yes, we're going to do it, and yes, I was in it with him, and we were going to do it, but it was very scary, and we discussed that in writing in 1976 in both marriage encounters.
Okay,
but that was a year and a half before he actually did it. How it would be risky, and
it wasn't something where he was just by himself putting the family at risk. It was something that you had encouraged and pushed him to do.
I don't know that I definitely encouraged and definitely supported him, but I've already explained that Gray Carey was not meeting his professional needs.
Right, and I know you've explained that.
Right.
Do you recall explaining in your book that you pushed him, and after much hemming and hawing, he did it?
Again, it's
Did you say
back to
that?
the book that was written in '88 when I was angry and suicidal. The real, you could have said I pushed him, but the real word is I wholeheartedly supported him and said, yes, I'm behind you 150%. Even if we lose the house, we can do this, because it was scary.
So I guess you are acknowledging...
You could say I pushed him, and you could say that I supported him 150% if that's pushing, but...
Are you acknowledging then that in 1988 anyway, that you said that you pushed him into doing it?
In the book, if that's what it says in the book, yes, that's what I wrote in the book.
And he went and picked out, once he decided to do it, he went and picked out some very simple furniture to decorate his office, and you were the one that encouraged and pushed him to buy the very expensive furniture so that his office would look right.
Right. I wanted to say if we were going to do it, we were going to do it right, and that's exactly the time I went and got this resale license I described earlier, because I got the furniture for his office half the price with that resale license. But yes, he had the finest looking office in town, and he had no clients, and that was my insistence.
And the family did not suffer any detriment by him doing that. He was immediately successful, correct?
He was very shortly thereafter successful, but because of the way the cases go, he didn't have a paycheck in the first, year or so, or a year and a half, or because of the nature of his cases. He didn't have people pay him by the hour, ever.
He did have an income, though. He was bringing home money in 1979. Like we've talked about, he was making $82,000 that year, correct?
I wouldn't know that. All I knew is we had a $500,000 line of credit at a bank, and that's what we were living on. That's what I knew.
The family didn't suffer any detriment by that. Is that correct? You didn't have to move out of your house. You didn't have to sell any furniture. You didn't have to go live in an apartment. In fact, in 1979, that was the year that you were able to put a pool in the backyard, correct?
We didn't suffer any detriment, but we were kind of put back to square one because of the $500,000 line of credit. We were living on loans, and the pool was all done on loans.
Okay. But you obviously had some discretionary money in order to put a pool in. Is that fair to say?
I wouldn't know that. Dan made those decisions. Dan got some kind of a mortgage. I knew nothing about that, but yes, it would certainly appear so if you put a swimming pool in.
If you knew nothing about it, how do you know that he financed it by way of a mortgage?
The swimming pool?
Yes.
Because I think at the time of the swimming pool, he refinanced the whole house or something and got a whole new mortgage that included money for the swimming pool.
Well, how
Or
is
a
it that you
second
knew
mortgage
that
or
if you
something.
knew nothing about the finances?
Because I would pick up, in passing, things like that.
When you separated in 1985, February of 1985, you were living in the rental at Avenue de las Andes, correct?
Yes.
And that was a very nice, beautiful
Yes,
home.
very
Big
nice.
5-bedroom
Right.
home.
At one point, Dan and I were thinking of buying it, but they wouldn't sell it. It was lovely, yes.
And at that point, when you separated, you had been married 15 years. 15 years, 10 months, correct?
Fine, yes.
You were 37 years old?
Yeah, I guess. I'll take your word for it.
Well, you don't need to take my word
Well-
for it. How old were you in 1985 when you separated?
38. Well, I wouldn't have had my 85 birthday, so I was 37. See, I believed you.
And this photograph that's already been, maybe it hasn't been marked. Well, may I have a photograph marked as People's Exhibit 68? I have another one that's been marked 67 that I'll identify in just a moment.
All right. People 68, can you describe it for the record?
An 8 by 10 photograph.
Of the defendant?
Yes.
So marked.
This photograph that's been marked People's Exhibit 68, this is a photograph of you, and it was a photograph that was taken in 1985, correct?
Yes, it says it in the corner.
Now, you had indicated that somewhere along the line, in order to please Dan Broderick, you had grown your hair down real long.
Yes.
Your hair's not long here.
That was 1983 on our trip to New York when I was doing the wrinkle stuff. That was 1983 because of the affair.
And how long had you grown your hair in 1985?
I can get you a picture of it, right down to where it was in college.
Okay, and then you cut it again in 84 or 85?
I don't remember, but On the trip to New York, I had long hair.
May I have marked as People's Exhibit 67, a poster board with a photograph of Elizabeth Broderick,
So marked.
showing you what's been marked as People's 67. Do you recognize that photograph?
Yes.
And when was that
I've never
taken?
seen it before, but I recognize myself.
Was that taken in December of 1985?
I don't know. I know it's Gail Forbes' living room because of the map.
Okay. And it was taken before a New Year's Eve party in December of 1985. Does that sound fair?
It was a New Year's Eve, so if you've got that year, it must be it.
So this was almost a year after you had been separated. You separated in February of 85, and this was almost a year after that, correct?
Yes. I think. I'm not really sure that that's that New Year's Eve. It could have been the next one. I'm not sure.
Okay, so you're indicating it could have been New Year's Eve of 1986. Is that what you're indicating?
Yes, it could have been.
Okay. When Dan Broderick moved into Coral Reef, you've indicated that the Coral Reef house was under construction, and he was simply living there in a sleeping bag or whatever, correct?
Yes,
as
the
far as you knew.
construction was the ground floor, the bedrooms were untouched.
And at the time, around the time of separation, excuse me, strike that, let me back up. Several months before you separated, before Dan Broderick moved to Coral Reef, you had actually left for a period of several days, just left the house, essentially disappeared as far as the family was concerned, and were gone for several days, right?
No.
You don't recall at any time leaving and going and staying at Vacation Village and staying away from the house for several days?
I don't really remember that, no.
Do you recall going over to Gail Ford's house afterwards and telling her that you had just left and you'd been staying at Vacation Village and living out of your car?
Unless she's talking about the time, I don't know. I don't remember Vacation Village, but I know I was homeless for a little while there in June, where I would have had to look for a hotel, but
Prior to separation, several months before February of 1985, you left the house and you were gone for several days.
no.
In fact, Kim described you being gone for several days, just disappearing, and the kids didn't know where you were at the time that you moved into the house, which would have been September of '84.
No.
That never occurred.
No.
Did you ever go over to Gail Ford's house and tell her that that occurred?
No. At the time that we moved, Dan and I had a fight the day that we moved because we had lived in our house for 10 years. He put his personal belongings in the red Corvette.
Excuse me, I know, Ms. Broderick, you've described that you had a fight, but isn't it true that when you left for several days?
No.
You're not aware, you don't recall going over to Gail Ford's house and her going down to Dan's house to check on him and the
I
kids?
read that in her thing, but I don't remember that.
Okay, so Gail...
Again, Betty doesn't recall a detail that would make her in any way look like a bad parent. In order for this statement, that Betty never left for a short period of time to stay at one of the other properties, to be true, Kim and Betty's friend would have to be lying, meaning that, for some reason, they would have conspired against Betty, the result of which is a very tame story about her leaving for a few days, which is obviously not the case, but once again, Betty tries to state that Kim and her friend are merely confused, because somehow she knows better than they do.
Do you remember when you did separate, having a conversation with Gail Forbes, where you told her that life would be easier if you just killed Dan, or if Dan was dead?
No.
Did you ever make such a statement to Gail Forbes?
No. But I can tell you what she might be thinking of.
Did you ever make such a statement to her about the time of your separation in February of 1985?
No, not that statement, but
Did you ever say anything to her about life would be easier if you just killed Dan or if he was dead?
no. But do you want me to go on a little bit?
Not
No.
particularly.
Okay, no.
I have very important things to ask you. You're making me mad. I'll kill you.
This was something that Betty had said multiple times, in court documents, to reporters, in her own book, but now on the stand, she claims to have never told her friend that.
And I don't mean to be rude by cutting you off, but counsel can ask questions on redirect if there's something else that he'd like to bring up.
Okay, fine.
In June of '85, you moved to the house on Calle de Cielo, and that house did cost $650,000. The property cost $650,000, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And at that time, Dan and all four of the children, by that time, were all living at the Coral Reef house, correct?
Yes.
Now,
And I was there every day.
when you moved to Calle de Cielo, you indicated that Maria Montez continued to be your maid, correct?
Calle del Cielo, yes.
Yes, okay. You continued, you had a gardener, you had a pool man, you had people helping you taking care of the house while you lived there at Calle de Cielo.
Right, you had to. There's no way I could have done it.
Between 1985 and 1989, you were able to put at least $200,000 into that house, into refurbishing it and fixing it up.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
And you've described redecorating the kitchen and putting in a pool house and carpeting the house and furnishing the house.
Right.
Now, you described that you fixed up the house in 1989 when you were getting ready to sell it. It is true, though, that the house was nice well before that. Several years before that, it was definitely furnished and carpeted and in a living condition.
It was a definite, very slow progression. It was a mess outdoors, you know. All the landscaping front and back was a jungle. It was horrible. So it was a very, very slow process, indoors and out. I mean, every speck of every room and every floor and every door, so it was a very constant but slow process.
As of 1986, you described the house that you lived in, though, as being a big, beautiful house.
I mean, relatively speaking, it was a dream home.
Okay.
Because of the location. It was an absolute piece of heaven, what you could see from that house without even moving. The whole back of the house, unobstructed. White water, ocean view, sunsets. It was beautiful, the view.
My question is, in 1986, did you describe living in a big, beautiful home with 2 great cars, having many friends?
Yeah, in 86, yes.
So as far as you were concerned, in 1986, you were living in a big, beautiful home.
I was very happy in that spot. And relative to the rest of the world, the $650,000 ocean view home in La Jolla is a beautiful home. It happened to have been very dirty and very messed up and cracked doors, but I could have fixed that. And I did fix that, some of it.
So that wasn't something then you're indicating that caused you too much emotional distress?
That the house was a wreck?
Yes.
When I lived there in the beginning with nothing, when I was, and I hope I've testified clearly to this, when I spent that summer there still expecting to knock the whole house down, I didn't move anything in and I didn't purchase any appliances or anything because I still thought we were knocking that house down in September. So that was very upsetting and disconcerting to me to live in a house in those conditions. I think I got a coffee machine.
Okay, but those conditions were taken care of by 1986. By 1986, you knew that you were going to be in that house. You knew that you had furniture. And you were living in a big, beautiful home.
I never knew. I had some furniture because Dan told me to get it out December of 85, just before he moved. The day he moved, he brought the truck over and he gave me some furniture. But it wasn't living room furniture. That I bought later. And it was bits and pieces. It was a very long process.
Right, and you're the way that you're talking about it to me suggests that you didn't feel tremendously upset about that. You knew that it was a long process and you were going to fix things up, and you were fixing things up.
Well, the thing is, I wasn't secure in that home, and as I fixed things up, I didn't mind buying furniture and towels and beds and that kind of stuff that could come with me. But when I invested in the building of that house, I was afraid I'd lose my money forever if Dan sold the house, or in the divorce I didn't get the house or something. So I was really torn about repairing the building of the house.
Mrs. Broderick, from the time that you moved into the house in 1985 all the way through to November of 1989, did Dan Broderick ever do anything to suggest that he was going to sell that house?
No, except the ELISA and the forced sale of Coral Reef.
We're talking about Coral Reef. Now I'm talking about Calle de Cielo. Once you moved into Calle de Cielo, you knew that was your house to live in. He never did. Did he ever do anything to suggest he was going to sell that house?
No, but all I got was a phone call after the other house was sold. So how would I know he wouldn't do the same thing with this house, and I'd get some phone call or a 4-hour notice that my house was gone?
Are you saying you didn't have any idea that Coral Reef was being sold but for that 4-hour notice?
Right, at that time I didn't know. I knew there were discussions.
We'll talk about that in just a minute. Just so that it's clear, there was never any action by Dan Broderick to do anything to sell your Calle de Cielo house, correct?
Correct, but there was also no action to take his name off it either.
Okay, and there was a reason for that. The bank wouldn't let him take his name off. He was the one that
He didn't try. He didn't try to take his name off.
Well, isn't it true that Dan Broderick was the one who had the income? Obviously, the bank was not going to allow him to take his name off that mortgage when you had no source of income.
Well, I don't know that.
That's not a correct
I don't know that.
statement.
Well, it's argumentative, sustained.
Do you recall him testifying at the divorce trial that he attempted to take his name off and they wouldn't let him because of the loan?
No,
That
because
he
that's
was the
not true.
security-
He never attempted to take his name off.
Okay. All during that time, you had your name on the property too, correct?
Yes,
And as of January of 1989, when the divorce became final, that property became your sole separate property, correct?
correct.
There was no doubt in your mind about that at the time.
Right.
Now, when Dan Broderick moved into Cyprus, the bulk of the furniture that had been at the Coral Reef house went to you. And he moved into Cyprus with just a fairly small amount of furniture, correct?
No, the bulk of it didn't go to me at all. The bulk of it went with him, but then he bought all new furniture.
Well, did you see the shape of his house when he first moved into it at Cyprus?
No,
You never went into the house at Cyprus when he moved in 1985?
no, not really. I know it was old, but I didn't ever, no.
You just mark one picture, People's Exhibits, 69. Which is a 5x7, 4x6, excuse me, photograph of the living room.
People 69.
Can I see the picture?
If you just take a look at this picture, and if you can, and you indicate, does that look like the Cypress house and the condition of the living room when Dan and the children moved in?
I wouldn't know, but I recognize my love seat, my sofa, my table set, the lamp, and our family's large screen TV there.
And you described that, with respect to the furniture, that you got a threatening letter from Dan about taking the furniture or else he was going to sell it? Something to that effect?
Yes, I think that's what it said. I think it said, get your junk out of the garage.
May I have marked as People's Exhibit 70?
70?
One-page letter dated November 26, 1985. You take a look at People 70. Do you recognize that letter as the one that Dan Broderick sent to you regarding the furniture?
Not particularly, can I read it real quick?
Sure, you can read it.
Okay.
Is that the letter he sent to you regarding the furniture?
Mm-hmm.
All right. In this letter, he indicates to you, I understand there are several pieces of furniture at Coral Reef that you would like moved to your house on Calle de Cielo. I will arrange for this as soon as you provide me a list of what you want. I am well aware that you want the desk, armoire.
I'm going to object to the reading of the letter.
I want to ask some questions about it.
Sustained. Ask questions about it.
Okay. There's a list of property here that he said you were well aware of that you wanted. The desk, the armoire, the love seats, but I'm not sure about the piano, the living room couch, the dining room set, the pewter flatware, the red easy chair and stool, the pink swivel chairs, the antique love seat, the coffee tables, the sofa table, the end tables, the table lamps, the Cibus, the corner cabinet.
Your Honor, I'm still going to object, Your Honor. She's reading the letter.
Sustained. Best evidence.
Did you let him know which of these pieces of property that you wanted?
See, we never had a discussion over what I wanted and what I didn't want.
What he's indicating here is that he wanted a
I
list
wanted
from
this sofa
you.
and it ended up at Cyprus, so I don't know how that happened.
Well, did you get the desk and the armoire and the love seats and the dining room set? And you get those pieces of furniture?
Those are exactly the furniture that I got, yes.
And you got the pewter flatware, and the red easy chair, and the pink swivel chairs, and the antique love seat, and the
No.
sofa table, the table lamp.
No, this is the antique love seat right here. I didn't get it.
Okay. Did you ask for it?
I don't remember. I mean, I don't remember.
How about the Cibus?
No, I think we kind of split that. He ended up with some of it, and I ended up with some of it. And those are just little statues anyway. Those aren't furniture.
It's likely that the lawyer was reading the letter out loud to show how communicative Dan was attempting to be at the time, and to showcase that the letter was by no means threatening. When you think of a threatening letter demanding that you pick up your items from a home, you think of something along the lines of, "You need to pick up your shit or I'm going to burn them in a fire and pour black paint all over them," like Betty had previously done. The letter that had been read out loud, and they are discussing, was incredibly matter-of-fact, going so far as to list the items that Betty could pick up if she so desired, and stating that he was willing to pay for shipping, delivery, and setup himself. This is far from the threatening mail she had previously described it as.
But it's the last sentence in the second paragraph that says, and if you don't tell me what you want or something, I intend to get rid of it or sell it or something. And I found that to be a threatening sentence.
The movers will be moving me from Coral Reef to Cyprus on January 3rd, so you have until then to let me know. Anything you don't indicate you want brought to Calle de Cielo, I intend to take with me or sell.
Right.
You thought that that was a threat?
Yes, I did.
Again, that is clearly not a threat. There is no reading between the lines. That is obviously not a threat or an attack, but Betty took it as such and used it as justification for her breaking into the home multiple times, vandalizing it, and again, driving her car into the house.
Was that an attack? You described that when you got letters from Dan Broderick that he was attacking you. Did you consider this to be an attack?
I said when I got legal papers from Dan Broderick.
Okay. And my question to you is, did you consider this letter to be an attack?
No, but I considered it controlling and threatening.
It is true that there was a period of time when you did not want the furniture in your house because you were
Yes.
fixing it up.
Because we were knocking it down.
Do you recall writing in your diary, "I didn't want to move any furniture here because the work could be much more easily and quickly done in the empty house"?
That's right.
Well, you're not talking about knocking down a house, you're talking about putting in carpet.
Well, what's the date of that?
Well, obviously it's sometime before you got your furniture.
Well, it's probably in the summer that I didn't want to move any furniture in because why? There was going to be extensive work, if not cut. One of our neighbors cut the house in half and carried it away. I didn't know if Don Edson would even want that house literally carted away. But certainly I didn't want any furniture in a house that was going to be totally redone.
Okay. So it wasn't that you were being deprived of furniture anyway, it was that you had made the decision that you didn't want the furniture there.
For a
correct?
certain amount of time, but that's in the summer. That letter's December 85, correct?
November 85.
Yeah. And there's another thing here is that we only had one set of furniture. And when Dan was moving to his house,
Yes, I know, you explained that.
well, I didn't want to take all the furniture, then what would they use?
Now, you have said on occasion since the time of separation that when Dan left you, he left you penniless and homeless and destitute, correct?
I didn't have any money. And I felt I was thrown out of the rental.
And so you've indicated that you felt you were left homeless and penniless and destitute?
I felt that way, yes. And I felt I was forced out of Coral Reef as well.
Betty had previously stated that Dan had left her penniless and destitute and unable to get back on her feet. However, now in court, she is clarifying that that is just how she felt, and not the reality of the situation. Again, Dan had paid over $600,000 for her new home. He had agreed to pay $20,000 in alimony to her every month, and he had offered to give her the furniture from their previous home. But to her, she felt like she was left with nothing, even though that objectively wasn't being left with nothing. In reporting around this case, a lot of weight is given to Betty's statements that after the divorce, he ruined her. But as was just shown, that wasn't at all what happened. Before you had your motion for support,
when you hired Mr. Hargraves, you filed a summary of your expenses in 1986, correct?
Mr. Hargraves did that.
And that was based on your expenses. You gave him all of your checks, and he went through all of the checks, and he marked the date, and he marked the check number, and he marked the amount and what you had spent them on, correct?
Absolutely not, no. If you have something like that, it would have come later. Mr. Hargraves did not use any of my figures to come up with his inflated expense thing that he filed at that time.
May I have marked, Your Honor, as People's Exhibit 71?
71. You
What
can
is
start
entitled Respondent Summary of 1986 Expenses?
somewhere.
Showing you People's 71. Is that a summary of your expenses for 1986?
This is a Tricia Smith thing, no? It says Harvey's name on it. Okay, but it's in 287. Okay, now what's the question?
The question is that a summary of your 1986 expenses?
Yes, but this was done after the December 30th court hearing.
Okay, so you're just indicating this was filed after the hearing, but this is an accurate reflection of your 1986 expenses, correct?
I don't know. You know.
Well, there are...
If he did ask for copies of my checkbook register, and then one of his secretaries put that together. I never used that. Hargreaves was a goner by that time.
Okay.
I never
Did you make
referred
a
to that.
summary of your expenses based on your checks? Are these, here are your check numbers, check date, and what you wrote the check to, and what the amount was?
Yes.
And the total expenses, the money spent by you in 1986 was $220,000.
Well, see, let me look at this here. That's, I don't know where I would have gotten it from. Okay, you're adding in the mortgage payments on the Del Cielo house. I never would have received that money. Dan kept that money out.
Okay, was the total, obviously that was a payment that was being made for you, correct?
A lot of those things were payments that Dan made for me, right? So see, that it doesn't add up like that.
Isn't the total expense, are you saying the total expenses of $220,000 is not correct?
I don't know if it is.
Okay, well, if you want to take the time to look,
Okay.
add it up.
Okay, let me first see what this is. Okay, he would have said that it cost that much to keep me in that house that year. But I didn't pay these bills, so, and I never had this money. A lot of it, some of it I did.
The checks came from your check register. That's where he got the checks and the check numbers. Obviously, you had made those payments. Isn't that correct?
I don't know if that's correct. I know he asked for my checkbook thing to make something, but I don't know if he used it for this. What I'm having a problem with is at what point Dan stopped taking the money out of a check he was giving me.
Mrs. Broderick, we're not talking about that. We're talking about how much money you spent in 1986 based on the checks that you wrote. And if you want to dispute that, that's fine. I'm asking you to take a look at that. And if we can, if you need to take some time to look at it, we can do that.
Your Honor, and I'm going to object as asked to the answer. She's already explained that she wasn't writing mortgage checks.
Well, with the district attorney's inferring that there's some mortgage checks in there, I don't know. She can take time to look at it and give an answer.
Okay, can we discuss this a little?
Well, let's not talk about the mortgage checks. We'll take
Okay,
the mortgages
let's talk about the
out.
MasterCard on that page there, right here.
Excuse me just a minute. It shows, for example, checks that were paid for your telephone bill, your gas and electric, your water, your pool service, your gardener, your food, your maid.
No, it doesn't say that. Look, this column says average monthly cost, and he somehow got an average, and then he would have times that figure by 12 to come up with that figure. This is not actual expenditures that I'm aware of, unless it's in there somewhere.
Okay, well, let's look at pool service, number 19. Doesn't it give a check? The date that it was written, January 6th,
Right.
and the total amount.
Right.
There's a total down at the bottom for all of those payments you made that year for the pool service. The total is $936. At the front where he makes a summary, he puts the exact amount of $936 that you paid for pool service. Now, he goes through and does that based on your checks for every one of these and ends up with this total.
Are you
correct?
sure? Are you sure? Because
If
I'm
you would
not
like-
sure.
If you would like to look at this and
If you're
challenge it.
sure, I'll believe it.
Okay.
If that's what that says, and you're sure that's what that says, I will believe it.
Did you spend $37,000 for clothes in 1986?
I don't know. And if I spent it, it could have been on credit cards that I didn't pay for. See, does that say these are things really paid for? Or are these things purchased and not paid for? And I'll believe whatever you tell me.
We'll look at the clothes. Check number 3329, date January 6th, payable to J. Magnan, amount $50.
Okay.
Okay, now are you indicating that that's not a check that you wrote?
No, I'm saying if that's what this says, I will believe every word of it. But I couldn't have agreed earlier until you show me things.
Okay, so looking here at clothing and at all of the checks that you paid, that you
Wait a
wrote.
minute, some of this stuff isn't, well, anyway, go ahead. A lot of this stuff isn't clothing, though. Any store that he has down there, like Neiman Marcus, is linens, a lot of it was, and Nordstrom's probably clothes, but I. Magnin had other departments, and Saks has other departments, and I told you I had to buy everything for this house. So he wouldn't have known if those were clothes by the name of the store.
Okay.
And Bullock's, I hardly ever bought clothes at Bullock's, so it must have been something else.
The last time that you testified, you didn't have any problems with this declaration. When I asked you if you spent $37,000 on clothes, you said sure. Did
Your
you?
Honor, objection.
Sustained.
Ask about a prior inconsistent statement?
You got something to refresh your recollection, go ahead.
No. My question to you is, do you dispute these checks and that these were expenses or checks that you were writing? If so, we will get the original checks. If not, we can introduce this.
If you believe that that's what that is,
Mrs.
I'll
Broderick,
believe.
that's not appropriate,
Okay,
and you know
is
it.
everything on there say it's a check?
But I
Give it
can't
back
get an
Just a minute.
answer.
Let me handle it this way. This is Broderick. She can't testify. You have to testify. So just tell her whether you think those are accurate copies of your checks or not. If you dispute those are your copies, just tell her.
Can I ask her a question?
No, that's not appropriate.
Are all of the figures in there based on
You
checks
can't-
of mine?
You can't ask her a question. If you want to
Okay,
see
what's-
them and see if they're your checks, you're entitled to do that.
If there are check numbers in there, they're my checks, okay?
Okay, you take a look, and you tell me if there's something in there that you don't think is attributable to you writing a check on.
I would just have to look at it. Here's a page that says,
Well, just look at it yourself, Mr. Broderick. If there's something there you don't agree with, then let her know.
okay, would you come up here, please? This is a page that does not have check numbers on it. It says February, March, April, May, June, places of my charge cards and where I made a purchase, and the amount of the purchase on a charge card. It doesn't say I paid for that.
Are you
You see?
disputing that you made that purchase with that charge card?
No, but I'm disputing that I paid this
So-
amount of money.
So what you're indicating is that you...
I had tremendous debts on credit cards, okay?
Did you spend $220,000 in 1986?
I cannot verify that without studying this more. I'm sorry. I know Mr. Hargreaves wanted to build up my expenses so that he could get me the support that he thought I should get, that astronomical amount. And I didn't know about these things when he did this. And he was already fired by the time this was done, so.
Betty is trying exceptionally hard to state that she had absolutely no money to her name after the separation, despite the fact that she had a landscaper, a pool boy, and a maid.
And here are checks payable to credit cards, but not the full amount, you know, payments, not the full amount. So this is not all just checks that I wrote. There are pages and pages here of Home Federal, Great American, Imperial Savings, charges on charge cards that were not in fact paid, okay? But they were in fact charged.
You didn't write checks to make those payments.
On the pages like this one.
On the charge card payments.
The charge card payments, I wrote checks to make charge card payments. If I owed $10,000 on a credit card, I only had to make a few $100 payment.
Right, and those are what is listed here under the check number and the payment that you made.
Right, but also on these pages where it's a month, not a check number. See right there, May, June, July, April, those are charges on credit cards. They've not been paid, okay?
So you're indicating that you made some charges on here that you never paid?
A lot. And the figure he came to was of everything that I bought, but not everything I paid for.
I'm going to leave this with you, and I want you to, when we take a break, take a look at all of the checks. And if there's any dispute with the amount of checks that you wrote, you can let me know.
I'm not disputing the checks that are in here, but it's not just the checks in here. It's the other category, as everyone will see when you submit it.
Okay. As of August of 1985, you indicated that Dan Broderick sat down with you and put together a budget and indicated that he was going to pay you $9,000 a month for support.
I thought that was October.
Do you?
Isn't that October?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was October.
Well, do you recall writing about it in your book and indicating that it was in August?
I'm just mixed up. If it was August, it was August.
Okay.
It was my memory, it was October.
And he indicated that he was going to make voluntary support payments of $9,000 a month, correct?
Yes.
And in addition to that, he was paying the income tax, the medical insurance, the house taxes, the home insurance, the car payment, the car insurance, and various sundry
Yes.
other things.
Yes.
It is true that he was making those payments without a court order. There was no court order that was requiring him to do that, correct?
There were no court orders of any kind. When we did that budget thing, there was no divorce. There was no...
You had been separated since February of 1985.
Yes.
Correct? February, March, April, May, June, July, August. So we're talking about being separated for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a time when he wanted you to take some responsibility for paying your own bills, right?
That's what he said.
Right, and that was because he was telling you that the marriage was over, that he wasn't coming back, even though you continued to refuse to accept that.
That's not what he ever said, no, because he was still lying about Linda. If you're saying it's August, and if we're going on it was August, he was still lying about Linda, he was still lying about everything, so no, he didn't say that. He just wanted me to lessen his burden of paying my bills.
Are you saying that he was planning on getting back together with you at that time?
How would I know? I mean, he didn't say anything about that. It wasn't a meeting about that. It was a meeting about that he wanted to give me a certain amount of money so I would start paying my own bills.
And that he explained to you that was because he was filing for divorce?
Absolutely not.
Do you recall him testifying at the divorce trial that he had told you over and over that it was over and that you refused to accept it?
That it was over, that in those words, that it was over?
Maybe not those words, but to the effect that the marriage was over, he was not going to move into Calle de Cielo with
Your Honor, I'm
you.
going to object during that testimony in '89 when he has a motive different than...
Sustained. You have a transcript, you want to show it or refresh your recollection, you can do that. Otherwise, go on.
I don't think she had any problems with her recollection. That wasn't the objection.
Well, if you want to show her what he testified to see if it refreshes her recollection, go ahead.
Do you have any problems with your recollection of him testifying to that?
Your Honor, what he testifies in '89 is not proper to bring before at this point in time. That refreshes her recollection of what he said in '85.
That's all I'm letting her ask so far, Mr. Early.
Technically, because there was no court order, he didn't have to pay you anything at that time.
Technically, that's correct.
And then in December of 1986, there was a court order from Napoleon Jones to increase your support to $12,500, correct?
I believe so, yes. It may have been January.
That's, when he was paying $9,000 a month, that was over $100,000 a year. That's $108,000 a year, correct?
I don't think I ever got $9,000 a month. It was his budget with the house payment. By the time he took off the house payment and other bills he said were mine, like those ones with the stickers on that we saw, that he said he was paying that were mine, I never got even half of $9,000.
Well, the bills were to be included in that. If he paid your
True, but I
bills,
never-
that was included in the $9,000 support.
Right, but I didn't get the 9,000. He started at the top of the page with that $9,000 figure, but it never got to me. He made payments out of it.
Right. And you had decided on $9,000 a month, which is
He had
$100,000
decided
a
on
year. And out of that was to come your mortgage and your gas and your electric and everything else,
And
right?
that's what he was hoping that I would settle for, yes.
Do you
Miss Wells, be a good time to take our afternoon recess?
Unfortunately, as of now, this is all the trial footage that has publicly been available. I am currently trying to get more footage, and should I be able to get that, I will be posting it here. Betty was found guilty of second-degree murder, which specifies that these murders were not premeditated, but did have malicious intent behind them. Betty stated after the sentencing that it was impossible for her to get a fair trial, given Dan had friends in the legal system. Even though my husband is gone, his friends are still here, she wrote in a letter from jail. If anything, my husband's influence in the legal circles has grown. She claimed that the judge and even her own lawyer had worked against her, as if, had she been able to say what she had wanted to say, she wouldn't have been found guilty of any crime. In interviews she would give after the trial, she would state that her daughter Kim had lied on the stand, and that she felt her daughter was the reason she was in jail, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she was in jail because she killed 2 people. She also publicly stated that she had no regrets about her actions, and even though she said in court that she was remorseful and wished to speak to Dan's family, she never has. In fact, she did the opposite, stating that Dan's father was abusive, and Dan's brother is a detestable human being who she always hated. Broderick was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, plus 2 years for illegal use of a firearm, the maximum under the law. In 2010, Betty was denied parole. According to an article written by Ann O'Neill, Betty gave a rambling statement in which she once again refused to take any accountability in the murders. She stated, after hearing Broderick's rambling statement in which she continued to blame her actions on her husband's extramarital affair and their bitter divorce, I allowed the voices in my head to completely take over, Broderick told the parole board. I took the lives of 2 wonderful people who were loved by many. Yet, when pressed for details on her actions, Broderick repeated what she said during her trials. Linda came at me and the gun went off. She was totally not remorseful, didn't even try, said Richard Sachs, a San Diego prosecutor who handles so-called lifer hearings. She was denied parole again in 2011, and again refused to acknowledge her part in the shooting. In front of the parole board, she claimed that she'd been pushed to the limit, and when she shot, it was an act of self-defense. This is ignoring the fact that she drove to the home, broke in using the key she had stolen from her daughter weeks before, had practiced shooting for months, and had bought the gun seemingly for this purpose. Lee also testified at this hearing for her mother, and stated that she should be released from prison. However, Daniel Broderick, who had been named after his father, was quoted as saying, "In my heart, I know my mother is a good person, but along the way she got lost. Releasing a lost person into society could be a dangerous mistake." The last time she went up for parole was in 2017, where she again was denied. District Attorney Bonnie Dumanis declared that Elizabeth Broderick remains an unreasonable risk of danger to society. She still has not developed appropriate insight or remorse for these gruesome murders, which she committed with a callous disregard for human suffering. As of today, she remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, California, and is claimed residing there is like living in a retirement village. The next time she will be up for parole will be when she is 84 years old. If you have made it to this part in the video, thank you. I appreciate your dedication in watching a video this long. If you like this video, please give it a like as it does help in the YouTube algorithm. Consider sharing, and if you haven't, subscribe if you would like to see more true crime content. If there's a case you would like to see me cover, or a case you would like to bring more attention to, let me know in the comments down below. With all of that said, have a good day, and remember to stay safe.